Through a journey of the creepy corridors of history, we may find some unsolved mysteries. As we venture into the shadows of the unknown, we may also find some odd things. A Pictish stone refers to a monumental stele that was carved with designs and symbols. Most of these stone designs are found in Scotland, in the northern and eastern areas. These stones are said to be the last remaining evidence of the Picts, and are dated from the 6th to the 9th century. There had been a period where the Picts became widely Christianized. The stones before this had no parallel from the rest of the British Isles. Around 350 objects have been classified as surviving Pictish stones. One such example was that of the ancient serpent stone of Loch Ness. Carvings that were left behind by the Picts would often show some strange-looking animals, such as one beast that was discovered on the walls of a Cotterton byre. The carvings show a strange beast, a crescent, a comb, and a mirror. An archaeologist named Kate McCullough stated that it's a mystery how it had taken until 2011 for this stone to be recorded officially. Kate furthered that there were more of these stones to be documented on the Black Isle, where this beast had been recorded. The archaeologist is also a co-founder as well as a director of archaeology for communities in the Highlands. She expressed that the stones probably came from the 5th to 7th centuries. McCullough explained that it was particularly unusual to find carvings such as these on the north side of the Moray Firth. The stone that contained the unknown beast is believed to have been kept indoors as it's not been subjected to weathering. It's also theorized that it may have been buried for some time before being placed on the wall of the byre. Isabel Henderson had come across the Pictish Beast stone earlier in 2011. Henderson is said to be an expert in the field of early medieval sculptures. She had alerted Highland Council archaeologists, which had eventually reached McCullough. It was McCullough who confirmed that the carvings were indeed Pictish symbols. She had also gone to identify some nearby stone carvings of a neighboring farmhouse. It was believed that the carvings on the farmhouse represented goose feathers, or perhaps fish scales. Both of these stones in question were found on private property that was built in the 19th century. The properties had been owned by the same family for 50 years up until 2009. McCullough noted that these drawings had not been mentioned during a local heritage project that had asked residents to suggest some sites of archaeological interest. The Pictish Beast and the goose or fish carvings had been documented by the Highlands Council's Historic Environment Record thereafter. McCullough maintained that it's an absolute mystery that this had taken so long for these peculiar stones to come to their attention. She also states that it's exciting to think that there are more of these stones to be found. Residents are encouraged to look out for Pictish stones in churchyards and dikes. As for the Picts who made these stone carvings, they were said to have lived in the northern and eastern areas of Scotland from the 3rd to the 9th century. Only very few written records of these people are said to have survived. The Pictish Beast has been compared to many animals, including elephants and horses. Some even thought it to be a dolphin due to the long snout and the curled appendage above its head that appeared to be water sprouting from a blowhole. Scholars believe that the beast may be a derivative of a dragon-esque brooch. This is a kind of status piece of jewelry that had been quite popular in British areas a couple hundred years prior to the production of the Pictish stones. But it's believed that the inspiration behind such a brooch had been hares and not dolphins. That being said, it may be possible that in the hundreds of years between the period of the brooches and the Pictish Beast, the anatomy of marine animals had influenced artistic depictions of the creature. Whatever ideology and belief system had contributed to the popularity of the Pictish Beast, as well as its distinctive aquatic transformation, is all lost to history. The Picts are said to have had their share of underwater monsters, which could have led to some stone depictions and resulted in the Pictish Beast. One such example was recorded in Life of Columba, written at the end of the 7th century. While crossing the River Bess while on a journey among the Picts, Columba had bore witness to the burial of a man who had lost his life to a water beast. In hopes of trapping the beast and ending the terror, Columba had ordered a monk to act as the bait.
Scotland's lochs, like the North Sea, have sparked many myths of marine monsters that are believed to dwell there. The exact meaning behind the Pictish Beast will always remain a mystery, but its resemblance to a dolphin is set in stone. Another carving had also been found that seems to depict another underwater beast named the Ancient Serpent Stone of Loch Ness. The Loch Ness Monster is a continuing mystery, and perhaps the Picts had known of it as well. A stone slab, believed to be of Neolithic origin, appears to depict a serpent creature. It had been discovered at a house which was situated near Loch Ness, before it had been knocked down back in the 1930s. It was suggested that the carving was a reference to some of the animals of Loch Ness. The story of this carving, though, dates further back. It was first mentioned in Ted Holliday's book in 1968, titled The Great Orm of Loch Ness. In the book, he recounts something that appears as a 1965 jungle expedition. He described the Neolithic carving and stated that it appears to be a depiction of the orm, and added various features that were reported by witnesses, including the vertical undulations, oval eyes, wide head, and its conical nose. But the author had been wasting his time searching for this mysterious carving, as it had actually been moved 10 years earlier to Scotland's Royal Museum for safekeeping. This stone is said to be one of more than 300 items that are known as Pictish symbol stones. The Picts had been one of the most mysterious races of people to have populated the northern parts of Scotland. Only very little is known about their culture and as to what their symbology had depicted exactly. Some of these stone carvings will forever remain a mystery. The Codex Gigas is better known by the term the Devil's Bible, and is an ever unsettling mystery. This historical text contains mysterious writings, secrets, and a rather sinister pact. Upon entering the realm of medieval Europe, this is the book that stands out the most among a collection of some of the oldest manuscripts. It's seen as both a historical gem as well as a creepy riddle. This ancient text has attracted scholars and amateurs to its fascinating yet terrifying contents. The book is said to contain an unholy union and is bound to terrify its beholder. The Codex Gigas shows remarkable craftsmanship and is described as a masterpiece. The manuscript weighs around 165 pounds. It's 36 inches tall and 20 inches wide. It's said to be one of the largest medieval volumes to exist. The Codex Gigas may hold some thrilling content, but it's a true work of art as described by many. In its pages, we find a wide variety of pieces demonstrative of a depth of medieval knowledge, which includes the entirety of the Latin Bible, historical narratives, fascinating topics, as well as medieval treatises. As for the aforementioned sinister pact, the Codex Gigas details a pact that was made with Satan himself. The manuscript is a clear example of how legends will combine both fact and fiction. A monk was said to have violated his vows and had been sentenced to be shut in his monastery cell. This was the horrific story that surrounds the text. The monk was said to have entered into a demonic deal out of desperation and an attempt to avoid his fate. The monk had vowed to the demon that he would make a book that would be the largest in existence as a return gift for saving his life. According to the legend, the monk was able to complete the Codex Gigas in a single evening with the aid of Satan. It was there that the book was born. In the center of the Devil's Bible, there's said to be a stunning piece of art that has since captured the interest of many. The artwork is a realistic depiction of the King of Hell. He stands tall and glares malevolently out of the parchment on which he's drawn. This representation has stirred rumors of the paranormal origins of the manuscript. Rumors are suggestive of the involvement of demonic entities who aided in the production of the book. It's uncertain and up for debate as to whether the drawing may represent the treaty in a symbolic manner, or if it captures the attitudes and the anxieties of the period. While this legend may be captivating, it's important to distinguish fact from fiction when trying to unravel such mysteries. The idea of a demonic alliance is based rather on fiction than a precise description as to what the book entails. It's assumed that the Codex Gigas is made by a monk who had been incredibly talented and had the skill of writing and art, all of which had given life to this important manuscript. The book currently resides in the National Library of Sweden in Stockholm.
It's said to be a monument to the tenacity and the creativity of its scribe, who is yet to be identified. The relevance of the Codex Gigas is said to reside in its addition to our general understanding of the medieval world. The manuscript represents human inventiveness as well as curiosity due to the enigmatic birth and the beauty of its contents. The manuscript is one that wants its mysteries to be unlocked and its secrets to be unearthed. The text is said to have been birthed in Bohemia and holds the Latin translation of the Bible as well as other religious writings. The script is bound in leather and is found to be around 800 years old. Its pages not only consist of religious texts, but also historical, medical, and magic-related aspects. It's suggested by experts that it was only one person who compiled the contents in the pages of the Codex, due to the consistent nature of the handwriting throughout the text. While the mythical legend suggests that the monk had taken one night to complete it in its entirety, it's also been suggested that the scribe took 30 years to finish it. This meant that one person had spent a good portion of their life dedicated to writing this codex. The manuscript has been examined by experts many times throughout the years, and it's been found that the codex consists of a painstakingly crafted and designed knowledge of various subjects and topics. It's said to be a labor of love and would require mental and physical discipline beyond what anyone could imagine. In its pages, the Bible contains the complete versions of both the Old and New Testaments, the Antiquities and the Jewish War, short works, medical texts, the Chronicle of Bohemia, and the Encyclopedia. It was also rumored that the book contained the Rule of Saint Benedict, but was lost to history. The Codex Gigas is shrouded in intriguing mystery, and the only thing that's known of its origins is that it was created by one person alone, and it had been established sometime in the 13th century. The popular theory was that of the legend that was previously mentioned. It suggests that the book was made by a monk named Herman the Recluse, but that's only a story. The manuscript is said to have had a rather long and uneventful history. It was initially mentioned in 1295 in a monastery's inventory. In 1594, Swedish troops had stolen the codex from the monastery during the 30 Years' War. It would remain in the possession of Sweden until it had been returned to Prague in 1883 for a short period of time. It would soon be taken to the National Library of Sweden in Stockholm. This is where it remains to this day. The Codex Gigas is important for various reasons. It's one of the largest medieval manuscripts that's still in existence today. It's also believed to be one of the most illuminating manuscripts from the Middle Ages. It also contains over 300 drawings, including the depiction of Satan. The Codex also offers a window into the medieval world. It's a manuscript consisting of all human knowledge of the 13th century. Should one ever get the chance to see this manuscript in person, it's encouraged that they take a closer look at the illustrations, particularly the one of Satan himself. It's there that one may get a glimpse into the soul and the life of the man who made the manuscript. Many have tried to unravel the mysteries that surround the Carolina Bays. The Carolina Bays refer to elliptical and sometimes circular depressions in the earth that seem to be concentrated in the regions along the east coast of the United States. They're found in areas of New York, Delaware, New Jersey, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and the North Florida area. Maryland has referred to them as Maryland Basins, and within the Delmarva Peninsula, these landforms as well as other ponds are known as Delmarva Bays. When the first engine-powered airplanes came into operation in the 20th century, it didn't only have the ability to move around but also presented a whole new perspective. From above, people looked like specks, and fields began to look like quilt. The United States pilots who flew over areas of the East Coast started to notice some odd landforms, the bays. What we initially believed to be some isolated ponds or wetlands then began to appear as a pattern of elliptical-shaped depressions that had been oriented in some way. The origins of these landforms still confuse the scientific world, as no one knows exactly what they may be or where they came from. But it's believed that they're as important to the landscape now as they were millions of years ago. The shallow landforms were given the name Carolina Bays because of how many of them there are and how they're situated along the coastal regions. This is the name given to any wetland that forms along the east coast, characterized by elliptical shapes and isolation, as stated by Kyle Barrett, who's a professor of wildlife conservation at Clemson University. He also stated that the formations can occur in lower areas of the landscape, and that they're believed to be filled up by only precipitation, meaning that they may dry out during the warmer seasons. In the 1950s, it's been suggested that the Carolina Bays were the result of a meteor shower due to their orientation, and they were found to be situated along a northwest to southeast axis, as well as some of them being concentrated in the one area. In an attempt to discover the origins of the formations, researchers took to carbon dating. Barrett explained that there had been some studies that made use of radiocarbon dating of some organic sediments or other methods in order to determine their age. It was determined by the use of this method that the Carolina Bays were not formed at the same time. Some are said to have had tens of thousands of years of difference between them, and others were found to be 100,000 years old, or as recent as 15,000 years old. This ruled out the theory of a meteor shower. Barrett further explained that there had been no evidence to support the theory of a meteor shower either. He states that the origin time was not suggestive of the theory, and that the material present did not have an extraterrestrial formation. The Carolina Bays do not bring about a message from the other world. Additionally, no space matter has been found in these sites, which automatically rules out the theory of UFOs and extraterrestrial visitors. But the next hypothesis was a more likely answer: the wind. It was theorized that 2.5 million years ago, a strong southwesterly wind blew over the ponds and caused some currents. These currents would wash against the southwest and northwest edges of the ponds, which resulted in a pileup of sediment. It's believed that this resulted in the formation of the Carolina Bays, but this can't be confirmed. At one point, there had been about 200,000 Carolina Bays, but according to researchers, 97% of them had been impacted by logging and agriculture. The impact that humans had on these bays did not just erase a part of our geological past, but also disrupted a delicate ecosystem that's important to species of the wetlands, including salamanders and frogs. While their name, Carolina Bays, may suggest this, they are in fact not bays at all. But it's not about what they are, but rather a question of how they got there. There are said to be many bay shrubs and trees growing alongside the formations, and they act as unique reserves for frogs, birds, turtles, and mammals. These formations also range in size from less than 1 acre to thousands of acres. The largest concentration of these bays is said to be found in Bladen County, North Carolina. Viewed from the ground, these formations may be overlooked, but from above, these bays have a dramatic impact on the landscape. Each of these creations has a distinct shape. They're sometimes described as crop circles of the wetlands, and to conspiracy theorists, this would not be their only connection to extraterrestrial life forms. Other theories as to what these formations could be ranged from wind patterns, ocean currents, and sinkholes to meteor showers and, strangely enough, large prehistoric beavers. The mystery of the bays had reached its height in the 1950s when William Prouty, a University of North Carolina geologist, had stated that these impacts had been the result of meteors that collided with the Earth 12,000 years ago. This theory was previously debunked. The idea that the bays had been formed through the impact of a comet linked the extinction event that's referred to as Younger Dryas to how the Carolina Bays were formed. This theorized that it was wind and debris from the comet that caused these depressions. Anthony Rodriguez, who was the associate professor of the coastal geology in Morehead City and a graduate student and an associate professor, had all set out to study the evolution and formation of the Lake Mattamuskeet, which refers to a conglomeration of Carolina Bays. There, they discovered that the creations were not linked to a cosmic event, such as the Younger Dryas extinction, as believed by William Prouty. But they did, however, find that the group of bays were younger by 6,000 years than what they were assumed to be. Instead of an icy comet, Rodriguez suggested that the Lake Mattamuskeet may have had a fiery beginning. An analysis had shown that periods of burning heat were associated with dry circles in the region, which ultimately caused the basins which would later fill up with water. The winds were believed to form the rim by displacing sediment, and after 1,000 years, a Carolina Bay would be the result. That being said, none of this can be confirmed as evidence remains unclear and unsubstantiated. There are many theories surrounding the Carolina Bays, but for the time being, they remain a landform mystery to the scientific and archaeological world. Montpelier Hill was once known as the Hellfire Club to the residents of Dublin. It was atop this hill that an ancient passage grave was set. In 1725, William Connolly, one of the richest men in Ireland at the time, built a hunting lodge on that very site. There had been a cairn of stones that was destroyed by Connolly to continue building the lodge. He'd even used one of the standing stones belonging to a grave as a lintel for a fireplace. After the lodge had been established, its roof had blown off during a storm. Some believed that it was the spirits seeking revenge for the destruction of the cairn. After Connolly passed away, the lodge would be reclaimed and would become the meeting grounds for the Irish Hellfire Club. This club had been founded in 1735 by a man who dabbled in black magic, Richard Parsons. Members of the Irish Hellfire Club would meet all across Dublin and were known for their immoral behavior. This had been an extremely secretive club, which led many to believe that they had been a club of Satanists. The president of the club had been referred to as the King of Hell and would dress up as Satan. He would be equipped with hooves, horns, and even wings. It was also discovered that the members would set a place for Satan during meetings, just in case he was to attend. Masses would also be held and would sometimes include sacrifices. Sinister stories of the club would soon arise. One story claimed that during one of the meetings, Satan himself made an appearance. It was said that a stranger had joined in on a card game, and when one of the members had dropped their cards and went to pick it up, they had seen that the stranger had cloven hooves in place of feet. The Irish Hellfire Club, though, didn't last long. In the early 1740s, it was dismantled, yet the community still loomed over the consciousness of the Dublin citizens. If you were to ask those who knew of the club, they may have described it as Masonic, a community of aristocrats who gamble and practice the dark arts. There were some notable members of the club as well. A portrait of a few of them depicts them as well-attired and well-to-do. The original Hellfire Club had been established in 1719 in England by Philip, the first Duke of Wharton. He was a controversial person and has been known for his excessive indulgence in intoxicating beverages, as well as his lewd behavior. Interestingly, it had been Philip Wharton who had sold the property to William Connolly. In 1721, the first Hellfire Club would be suppressed by King George I. The establishment of this club has been erroneously attributed to Sir Francis Dashwood. At the time, Dashwood was too young to join the first Hellfire Club, but had been involved with another in the 1730s, and would later go on to establish his own Hellfire Club. In 1755, Dashwood's club would become notorious. They would later be nicknamed the Monks of Medmenham Abbey, because they would meet in an old monastery on the Thames banks. Dashwood's version of the organization had fit in with the characteristics of all the others. They had additionally performed profane versions of the Franciscan ceremonies. It's said that both the English as well as the Irish Hellfire Clubs had not been particularly rigid formal structures. They would be described rather as a group that shared a special interest. It had been designed for a hedonistic and self-indulging purpose. The members would amuse themselves with various methods of self-indulgence, as well as shocking the rest of society. As for the Irish Hellfire Club, they rose to be infamous by mocking the church, which would take the questioning of controlled and organized religion to a different level. A letter dating back to 1738 that was authored by a member of the organization who went under the alias of Malak had described the group as well as their practices. It was also included here that new recruits would have to recite a declaration before they were permitted entry. The club would soon become known notoriously for their excesses that would be publicly conducted. Violence and intoxication often accompanied one another. The Hellfire Club captured the attention of Jonathan Smith through their acts of blasphemy. Swift rallied against them and detailed them as monsters whom Warsdale was the leader of. The Irish Hellfire Club was known for indulging in rituals as well as making pacts with Satan. They would also meet to drink from a silver bowl, as seen in the aforementioned portrait. Another one of these stories surrounding the club was that of a young farmer who had been curious about the meetings. He was invited into the lodge by one of the members and was permitted to view the activities that were set to take place that night. He left the following morning trembling. As the legend goes, he was unable to speak for the rest of his life and could not remember his name. In one of the more famous tales, there's also a black cat who's said to prowl a room in a nearby farmhouse. The story states that a visitor had slept in this room before being found deceased the following morning. When the priest arrived there, he saw a black cat prowling around, but it was not an ordinary cat. According to the story, the cat was large in size, and its ears took the shape of horns. The priest reportedly attempted an exorcism, and later the host, the visitor, who is believed to have been the deceased visitor, was found lying on the floor. The Enfield Poltergeist is one of the most well-known cases of paranormal activity in history. In August of 1977, single mother Peggy Hodgson alerted the authorities to her house on 284 Green Street in the North London area of Enfield. Peggy was the mother of 4 and reported that her daughters were hearing some strange and unidentified knocking. No one was able to figure out where it was coming from. Before alerting the authorities, Peggy went over to her neighbors, who had also been disturbed by what they had heard. Soon after, the mother notified the police. One of the attending officers reportedly saw one of the chairs in the house moving all on its own. They would then go to turn to the press, and for the following 18 months, the stories as to what was happening at the house would grow increasingly strange. On occasion, furniture would be thrown across the room, and a paranormal whistling could be heard. One of the daughters, Janet, reportedly spoke with an elderly man in a raspy voice. Soon, this paranormal case would grab the attention of the Society for Psychical Research. 2 of the members were sent to investigate the happenings at Peggy's home. One member was a former inventor who became a paranormal investigator named Maurice Gross, and the other was a writer named Guy Playfair. The story that follows may seem rather familiar. The Enfield Poltergeist had actually been the inspiration behind The Conjuring 2. The case in question had involved some strange choices: moving furniture, flying objects, cold breezes, and even levitation. While some immediately dubbed the case a hoax, this investigation ended up being one of the most witnessed cases of paranormal activity in history. On the evening that the activity began, Peggy had heard noises coming from her daughter's room. She went to tell them to go to sleep, but instead found them huddled in the corner looking afraid. Janet informed their mother that the chest of drawers had been moving by itself toward the door. Peggy told them not to be silly, but soon witnessed it for herself. It appeared that the drawers were being driven by an unseen force, as though the presence was trying to trap the 2 girls within the room. When Peggy attempted to push the drawer back against the wall, it didn't seem to want to move. This was when the family became so scared that they ran over to Vic and Peggy Nottingham's house. Vic had gone to investigate while the mother of 4 made contact with the authorities. While one of the officers had seen a chair move right across the room by its own accord, it was found that the circumstance was not a police matter. This was only the beginning of what was due to unfold for the next 18 months. As these occurrences continued, Peggy contacted a famous publication, the Daily Mirror. Once the reporter arrived, though, the house was quiet and undisturbed. It was only when the reporter had gotten up to leave that some things would start to happen. It was alleged that a Lego brick had hit the photographer above the eye, which would cause a mark that remained for a few days. It was here that the publication would contact the Society for Psychical Research. During his visit to the house, investigator Gross had found over 2,000 occurrences of a supernatural nature. It had been during his stay that the entity would begin to speak with Janet. She was said to have gone into a trance-like state and started speaking in a scratchy and male-like voice. She would claim that she was the ghost of Bill Wilkins. Bill Wilkins had been a resident a few years prior and passed away due to a hemorrhage. The entity of Wilkins would speak through Janet for hours. Throughout the haunting period, the house would be visited by several other researchers, including the demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren. While it was confirmed by Ed and Lorraine that something supernatural was plaguing the house, the skeptics still remained. They believed it was the children who were behind the hoax and were faking possessions. 2 of the experts had questioned the gruff voice that Janet had spoken with, and also caught the children bending spoons. Janet explained that they would purposefully fabricate some of the events to see if Gross and Playfair would call them out, and they did each time. The events had eventually ceased, but not after Janet had spent some time in the Maudsley Psychiatric Hospital after being affected by the haunting. In an interview, Janet stated that this haunting was one that's never left her and follows her still. A series relating to this case was also later released, which made the use of Gross's original tapes that he made during his visit and investigation of the poltergeist. There's said to be a plethora of information regarding this case, including images and videotapes taken by paranormal experts as well as journalists and reporters. In addition to paranormal experts, there had also been a doctor who explained how one would produce a ghostly voice, making use of the frontal part of the vocal cords. He was given as much weight as another expert, who stated that the poltergeists rarely bothered a house or a family for more than just a couple of days. There's also a famous image that has since done the rounds. It's of a young girl levitating in a ghostly way. She was also recorded at this time speaking in a raspy voice of a man who had occupied the house previously. Graham Morris had been the photographer of some of the occurrences in the house and recalls some of the events. He was in his early 20s at the time when he was working the night shift at the newsroom. Peggy's neighbors had called him and asked for help as there had been some ghostly happenings in the house and the family were beside themselves. Morris arrived there at midnight and was taken to the kitchen with his colleague. There, they would witness items flying around the area before a Lego brick caught him above the eyebrow. The children had been in a state of panic and distress. Peggy and her children had been in a separate room at the time. Morris argued that he was certain they had no involvement in the activity. He believes that the Lego brick could not have possibly been flicked at such a powerful force by one of the residents. A poltergeist refers to a disembodied spirit or force that's characterized by malicious or a disturbing intention. They're said to make some inexplicable noises, sudden movements, breaking and moving furniture in a household. They're also believed to be able to throw stones and be unpredictable as well as repetitive, hence why the haunting lasted as long as it did. It's found that a poltergeist will often latch on to one member of the family, usually an adolescent. It uses harassment as its weapon and sometimes physical harm. Usually when there are strangers present, the phenomena will cease, which is why it had stopped when Morris had entered, but continued right before they left. Of over 2,200 people who were aboard the famous Titanic when it struck an iceberg on its maiden voyage, only 705 people survived. Possibly the most famous of these survivors is Violet Jessup, who went on to survive the sinking of the Titanic's sister ship and gained a reputation for being unsinkable. But Violet wasn't the only Titanic survivor to go on to survive the terrifying ordeal a second time. The unsinkable stoker Arthur John Priest would endure a total of 4 sinkings before he finally decided to stay on dry land. Arthur was born in Southampton in 1887 and was one of 12 children. He started working at a young age, and like many young people who grew up in Southampton, the most work would be found aboard ships. He would work in the boiler room as a stoker, putting coal in the boilers and making sure the giant steamships ran smoothly. It was hard work in extremely hot conditions. Arthur's first maritime disaster took place years before the Titanic would even set sail. At the age of 21, he joined the crew working on the RMS Asturias, a Royal Mail ship. On its maiden voyage in 1908, it collided with another ship and was severely damaged. Miraculously, the crew managed to get the ship back to port, and everyone survived the encounter. But they would have known it was a near miss. If it had been just a little further from port, the Asturias wouldn't have made it. 3 years later, Arthur was on board the RMS Olympic. This was the biggest ship built for the White Star Line Company up to this point, and it was to sail between Southampton and New York. This was the first time Arthur would have worked with Violet Jessup, a stewardess on the ship, though it's unlikely they would have spent much time together. On September 20th, 1911, the Olympic was involved in a collision with another ship, HMS Hawke. The two ships were sailing parallel as they left the harbor in Southampton, but the Olympic began to turn in the direction of the Hawke. The Hawke couldn't move out of the way in time, and the two came together. The Olympic was damaged above and below the waterline and began to sink, but managed to limp back to port. Only a few people aboard the Olympic were wounded, But the Hawk wasn't as lucky, and many people were trapped aboard as it sank. There were a lot of questions being asked about the White Star Line after the accident, as it was blamed for the collision and had to pay for repairs and legal bills. It caused a huge hole in the company's budget, which meant that they were keen to get sailing as soon as possible. It wasn't all bad for the company, though. The Hawk was designed to ram ships in battle, with a bow specially created to cause damage to other warships. It had done some significant damage to the Olympic, even though they were both traveling at low speed. Despite the fact that the Olympic was only a cruise ship, it had survived the ordeal, which added to the reputation that these Olympic-class ships were unsinkable. It would be a good reputation to have, as the White Star Line launched the Olympic's sister ship, the Titanic, a few years later. By this point, there was an issue in the stoker industry. A coal strike meant lots of stokers couldn't find work. Luckily, or unluckily, Arthur Priest managed to find work aboard the Titanic, which needed roughly 150 people to work to power its engines. The story of the Titanic is now infamous, with the ship hitting an iceberg just 4 days into its maiden voyage. One of the first areas to fill with water was the boiler room and other areas surrounding it. It wasn't until the engine stopped running that many passengers realized that something was wrong. Arthur wasn't actually on duty when the accident happened, but he was still deep in the ship. Escaping meant navigating a maze of corridors and narrow passageways, all while there was chaos going on around him, and without any power to help guide them. Of the 150 people working in the boiler room, only 44 managed to escape. This included Arthur. By the time they reached the deck, all lifeboats had been launched. As men, they likely wouldn't have gotten a spot, even if they had gotten there earlier. Arthur jumped into the freezing water, wearing only a vest and shorts. This was what he would have worn for work, due to the stifling temperatures in the boiler room, and he didn't have time to get any other clothing. By the time rescue boats from other ships arrived at the scene, many floating in the water had already frozen. Arthur was suffering from frostbite, but miraculously survived and was brought aboard a boat. Despite the terrifying ordeals, Arthur continued to work on ships. When the First World War began, he was one of millions of British men who served. Given his experience, he was put to work on the HMS Alcantara, an armed merchant cruiser, in his usual role of coal stoker. This ship was part of the Northern Patrol, part of a blockage to stop Germans from getting supplies through the North Sea. In February of 1916, the Alcantara came across what it thought was a Norwegian ship. It asked this unknown ship to stop for inspection, which it did. Arthur's ship came closer to conduct the inspection, but once it was in range, the unknown ship opened fire. This was a German ship called the Grief, and it struck the Alcantara's bridge. There was significant damage to the ship, and the engine room began to flood. The ship managed to launch a counterattack which struck the Grief as it sank, but it could not be saved. Arthur and his co-workers managed to escape, and he was once again forced to jump into freezing waters and wait for rescue. Thankfully, another British ship arrived at the scene relatively quickly, and most of the men aboard the Alcantara were saved, among them Arthur Priest. Having survived 2 sinkings and 2 other accidents, Arthur was beginning to get a reputation. But this was an era when sinkings weren't too uncommon, especially considering this was during the war. It wasn't enough to convince anybody that Arthur was actually cursed. Arthur got another job working aboard the HMS Britannic, the third of White Star Line's Olympic-class ships. Again, he would be aboard the same ship as Violet Jessup, and again, the ship sank. This time, it was sailing in the much warmer waters of the Mediterranean when it hit an underwater mine off the coast of Greece. The holes rapidly filled with water, and even though the captain tried to get the ship closer to shore, it was no use. At this point, somewhat used to escaping sinking ships, Arthur managed to escape from the boiler room and was picked up by a lifeboat after jumping into the water. The final ship Arthur worked on was the SS Donegal, which was working as an ambulance ship. In April of 1917, the ship was trying to cross the English Channel, carrying 610 wounded soldiers from France to Southampton. She had already survived one near miss with a German submarine, which had tried to attack in March. That time, she managed to outrun her attacker, but the second time wasn't so lucky. She was hit by a weapon from the submarine and sank midway between France and England. 29 wounded soldiers and 12 crew members lost their lives in the accident. One of these was Archie Jewell, another Titanic and Britannic survivor. Arthur was more lucky. He suffered a serious head wound and almost lost consciousness while still in the water, but was pulled out by another sailor and managed to survive. After this last accident, when he became closest to losing his life, Arthur decided to stop. His head wound meant he was out of action for the remainder of the war and decided not to continue working aboard ships as a civilian. Even if he had a choice, he remarked that lots of people no longer wanted to sail with him. He spent the remainder of his life in Southampton with his wife and 3 children, before passing away at the age of 49 from pneumonia. It's little coincidence that more than one ship lies somewhere within the Goodwin Sands, a sandbank off the coast of Kent, England. More than 2,000 ships have sunk there, earning it the nickname the Great Ship Swallower. What's more of a coincidence is that 2 ships with the exact same unusual name have sunk less than a mile away from one another, due to a simple error. The first of these ships was the SS Maratha, which first set sail in 1892. The ship was named after the Marathi people, whose empire ruled a large part of India between 1674 and 1818. Why the ship was named this is unclear, though the ship's main route was between India and England. It was owned by the Brocklebank Lines Company and spent most of its life transporting cargo from Calcutta in India to London, England. The only time it strayed from the course was when it transported troops for the Boer War in South Africa. The ship weighed more than 5,600 tons and was 446 feet in length. On April 9, 1909, the Maratha was preparing for its final approach to London. 90 crew members and 17 passengers were on board, and many would have been looking forward to celebrating Easter that weekend. Also on board were 10,000 tons of cargo, mostly tea, rubber, rice, and jute. Getting to London meant passing through the Strait of Dover and past the notorious Goodwin Sands. Goodwin Sands was a tricky area off the coast of Kent. Thousands of years ago, there was a chalk ridge that stretched over the Strait of Dover. While it had washed away long before humans arrived, a deposit of sand lies in its wake on the English side of the strait. Sometimes that's a good thing. It's a place for ships to shelter, which may be why it was called Goodwin Sands in the first place. Goodwin could come from the name Godwine, meaning good friend in Anglo-Saxon, but it also has a dangerous hazard. The area is close enough to the surface to be exposed at low tide, and the shifting sands make it difficult for even experienced sailors to know where it's safe. A series of light ships are set up around the area to try to help guide ships past the sandbank. The weather was calm, and it should have been smooth sailing, but the pilot, Captain Illeri, didn't recognize the gull light and took the wrong course. The Maratha became stuck fast. The captain tried to maneuver the ship back out of the bank, but he then realized that the ship was leaking badly. The propeller shaft was bent, and hundreds of rivet heads had been sheared off. Trying to get the ship going again by itself would be dangerous. Over the next day or so, many smaller boats surrounded the Maratha. There were lifeboats from the nearby town of Deal, which took away most of the passengers. One of the 3 passengers that had stayed on board was a woman who didn't want to abandon her dog, but also didn't want to bring it ashore. If it arrived on shore in Deal, it would have been quarantined. Also arriving were boats that offered to take cargo ashore. This was on the agreement that these sailors would get a small cut of the profit from the sale of these goods. 621 crates of tea, 280 bales of jute, and 18 cases of rubber were brought ashore. But about 24 hours after she first became stuck, the Maratha shifted slightly, and it became more dangerous to rescue cargo. Finally, there were tugboats, which tried to help get the ship unstuck. When 2 boats didn't work, more tugboats were brought. The number was increased until April 11th, when 9 tugboats were trying to get the ship free. The effort pulled the ship apart, and it tore in 2. The crew and remaining passengers were rescued. Some sailors jumped overboard for fear the ship would sink too quickly. All but 1 person survived the accident, though his passing appears to be unrelated to the accident itself. Lloyd's estimated that the cost of the cargo lost alone was 250,000 pounds, the biggest loss of that year. Brocklebank Lines continued operating though, bringing goods from India to England. 8 years later, it launched another cargo ship named SS Maratha. This one was just a foot shorter than its predecessor, but was about 1,000 tons heavier. Like the former Maratha, the ship would be bringing tea, rubber, jute, and rice from India. But it would be doing so in a much more dangerous time. The second Maratha survived her first 20 years of service without any issue. But in 1939, the Second World War started, and she became a target for Axis powers. The ship was painted black to obscure its point of origin, in the hopes that it might stop it from being sunk. Remarkably, it wasn't enemy forces, but another wartime issue that caused the ship to sink. There was a blackout in England, so German planes wouldn't have an easy time locating population centers and important areas to target. That meant no light boats at Goodwin Sands. There were also mines in the area to prevent enemy shipping. To help Allied ships trying to get through the area, pilots specially trained would be taken to the larger ships to navigate them through this area. Ships had to anchor further away in an area called the Downs for inspection by contraband control, and for the pilots to be brought on board. In October of 1939, the Maratha was inspected and then given the all-clear to go. The captain, Captain Hill, didn't wait for the specially trained pilot and pulled up his anchor to try to make it to London by himself. As was the case with the earlier Maratha, human error caused the ship to get stuck on Goodwin Sands. Again, the ship wasn't too fast, and the crew were gradually ferried away from the ship in lifeboats sent from the town of Deal. The Maratha was torn in two by tugboats trying to get it free. Moments later, the engine erupted, sending smoke and debris flying. One person lost his life in the accident, but there were no other casualties. The location of the sinking was less than a mile away from where the original Maratha sank, but later divers would make an amazing discovery. The second Maratha was gradually broken apart by the currents and the sand. As it did so, what it was lying on was revealed. The second Maratha had come to rest on top of the first, with the shifting sand having put the two ships in exactly the same place. Brocklebank Lines lost most of its ships during the war and decided not to name another ship Maratha. The two sinkings in the same place were likely just a coincidence, but company management decided that it was better not to tempt fate. This wouldn't be the last ship ever named Maratha, though. In 1943, the Royal Navy launched the HMS Maratha, which met a similar fate to its two civilian counterparts. The Navy one sank after being torpedoed by an enemy vessel of Norway in 1944. Throughout human history around the world, humans have had a fascination with snakes. They've come to represent everything from the devil to medicine and rebirth. The fact that humans separated by oceans have made those associations isn't too much of a coincidence, but a specific snake creature reappearing around the world is a little more mysterious. The seven-headed snake creature appears in mythologies, originating as far away as India, Mesopotamia, and Mexico. Today, the most famous snake-headed monster is the Hydra, from the ancient Greek myth of Heracles. The number of heads this monster had varied from telling to telling, and it would get even more every time one was removed. But while this monster didn't specifically have 7, one of the creatures that inspired it did. The ancient Greek myths often took inspiration from other Near Eastern religions, including the famous Sumerians. The Sumerian religion dates back to around the 4th millennium BC, around the same time that writing was invented. Their religion changed a lot over the years, but there are at least 2 partially recorded stories that feature 7-headed snake creatures. Both of these myths involve the god Ninurta, a god associated with framing among other things. Neither myth has been well preserved, and a lot of the meanings behind them have been lost over the centuries. The first involves a series of minor deities and monsters that Ninurta had to defeat. One of these was called the Snake with 7 Heads. After the beast was destroyed, it was hung from the god's chariot. Another myth about Ninurta features the god using a weapon described as the 7-mouthed Musma serpent. It's not clear if this is the same being as the one Ninurta destroyed, but together these likely would have contributed to the story of Heracles and the Hydra. Those similarities aren't coincidences, and the fact these two Sumerian deities had 7 heads isn't too strange, but they're far from alone. There are many other 7-headed snake monsters that have appeared in carvings, protecting or attacking more famous deities. There's also the creature described in the Bible's book of Revelation. While the Leviathan is only described as a single snake, the monster that's described in Revelation 12 has the now familiar 7 heads. The Bible describes a giant snake with 7 heads, with a crown on each head and 7 horns. The snake fights Michael and his angels and is thrown out of heaven, eventually revealed to be the devil. The fact this creature has 7 heads is entirely coincidental, because it isn't related to the earlier Sumerian creatures, but the 7 heads are supposed to represent the 7 hills of Rome. Not all 7-headed snakes that appeared in mythology are evil. Snake-headed goddesses appear around the world. One of the oldest is Mansa, a Hindu fertility goddess with a hood made up of specifically 7 snakes. Mansa is a goddess of serpents, and one story about her features her being born specifically so that she could control a large number of snakes and other reptiles that had taken over the earth. There doesn't appear to be a story specifically about 7 snakes, and why she has that number for her hood isn't clear. On the other side of the world, another similar goddess was worshipped in Aztec mythology. Her name was Chicomecoatl, which translates to 7 serpents. Like Mansa, she's a fertility goddess. Small statues of her were mass-produced in Aztec times. She would be worshipped to ensure good harvests, but when harvests were bad, it was believed that she was responsible for it. These depictions of the goddess varied. Many depicted her with an ear of corn and using the sun as a shield, but another common feature were the 7 snakes she was named after. Some depictions even showed her with 7 snakes for her head. It's theorized that the idea of the Chicomecoatl comes from the stars. The figure of a woman holding an ear of corn is similar to the constellation of Virgo, which is depicted as a woman holding wheat. Virgo is next to the constellation of Hydra in the night sky. But unlike the mythical Hydra, the constellation Hydra is only a single snake rather than 7. If this is where the Aztec goddess came from, the people interpreting the stars not only interpreted them the same way as people on the other side of the planet, but also decided to switch from 1 snake to 7. Another 7-headed goddess might date even further back than these two. Recently, petroglyphs that were unearthed in the Caucasia region of south-central Russia seem to have added another 7-headed snake deity to the list. Experts have dated this to around 5000 BC, but not much else is known for certain. The petroglyph in question is of a stick figure with 2 arms and 2 legs. It has 1 long central neck, with 6 additional necks attached to it. There are many smaller figures around it, and a tree to one side. The strange figure is taller than the tree. Experts believe the mysterious figure is a creature with 7 heads. Its stance makes scholars believe it's a fertility goddess, as these are often depicted slightly crouched. Also depicted in the petroglyph is a circle with a cross and 4 dots. This is the same symbol used to depict the sun for the Aztec goddess. If this interpretation is correct, then this ancient petroglyph found in central Russia has a lot of similarities with a god worshipped in Mexico thousands of years earlier. It's possible that there was even some more ancient deities that both of these originated from, with ancient Native Americans taking the story of this 7-snake goddess across into the Americas. Or coincidentally, 2 ancient cultures developed the same deity independently. There are many chilling coincidences of life imitating art, but there's probably none more disturbing or with such long-lasting impacts as that of China Syndrome and the 3 Mile Island disaster. It started with China Syndrome. The term was used to describe what would happen if the core of a nuclear reactor was exposed to air. It would go into a meltdown and melt through the ground of the facility, even through the earth itself before emerging in China. Of course, this wouldn't actually happen, but in the 1970s, when nuclear power was still new and a futuristic idea, there were some people that believed this was a possibility. It was this theory that inspired James Bridges to make the film The China Syndrome. The movie was about a nuclear power plant meltdown in California, and the subsequent cover-up of the disaster. A news crew is visiting the Ventana nuclear power plant for a human interest story. It's supposed to be a light-hearted piece about alternate power, but during the visit, something appears to go wrong. One of the monitors shows that there's too much water in the reactor, and the staff shut off the water levels entering the core. A short time later, they notice another monitor showing extremely low levels. Someone taps the first gauge and realizes the needle has simply been stuck at the high level. It hadn't actually been that high. The mistake is realized and the water is pumped back into the reactor, making sure the core isn't exposed. The TV crew had secretly filmed the entire event and showed the footage to experts. Experts say that they'd come close to a nuclear meltdown and a China syndrome event. The rest of the film is about the small news team and one member of staff at the plant trying to expose the cover-up and just how dangerous the nuclear power plant is, only for the plant management to fight back. The movie, which starred Jack Lemmon and Jane Fonda, was released on March 16, 1979. It received critical acclaim from moviegoers. Movie critics claimed that it was so realistic it felt as if something like this could really happen. People working in the nuclear industry were less moved. The film was described as pure fiction and a character assassination of the industry. One nuclear engineering professor quoted a study which concluded that a nuclear power station meltdown was as likely as a huge meteor striking a major city. Other experts admitted that a small mistake, like the one that happened in the movie, could lead to a major meltdown, but said that it was very unlikely that such a mistake could happen. A meltdown also wouldn't send the radioactive core of the plant to China. It would sit at the bottom of its containment chamber instead. The larger danger would be a hydrogen eruption, sending nuclear particles into the air. Understandably, a lot of criticism concerned the characters of the plant management, the antagonists in the movie, who repeatedly ignore or cover up problems brought to them, even by other staff members. Given how dangerous a nuclear meltdown could be, in reality, these people took their jobs and safety involved very seriously. They didn't want the public to think that they would risk a major meltdown due to money. The debate among experts about the film featured in the New York Times paper on March 18th. 10 days later, the 3 Mile Island nuclear facility had a near-catastrophic meltdown, with circumstances eerily similar to those portrayed in the film. At about 4 a.m. that morning, there was a relatively minor malfunction at the plant, which is located in Pennsylvania. Within a second, there had been an automatic shutdown to avoid the sort of meltdown feared by those who watched the China Syndrome movie. A pilot-operated relief valve then opened, all according to protocol, allowing coolant to flow into the drain tank. After 10 seconds, the signal was sent to close the valve. There was no instrument indicating whether the valve had closed or not, but one showed that the signal had been sent, and there was no reason to believe that it hadn't. But the valve hadn't closed, and water continued to leak out. Water escaped into the pressurizer, which normally would have only happened if the container was becoming too full. Like the movie, staff believed there was too much water in the system and reduced the flow of the water. Over the next couple of hours, steam built up, and the nuclear core was exposed. It overheated, and the meltdown started. At 6:22 a.m., staff realized that the valve was not closed, and a block valve was closed to prevent further water from flowing out of the area. A state of emergency was declared, and more than 40% of the core melted due to the heat. But after 7 hours, the cooling system was working as it was supposed to be, and everything was back under control at the plant. There were still some problems due to gases getting into places they shouldn't be, and a large hydrogen bubble was cause for concern. But over the course of a week, the bubble was removed and everything was okay. The same couldn't be said elsewhere. The media had picked up on the story and believed this to be a much bigger disaster than it really was. At one point, radioactivity levels from within the plant were misunderstood as being from an area outside. The people living around the plant believed they were in very real danger, and the local government issued recommendations for evacuation, or to simply stay indoors. It would be weeks before those evacuated returned to their homes. There hadn't actually been any radioactive material emitting from the power plant. The worst that had been released were some noble gases. It was found that being in the evacuation area would have exposed people to radiation the equivalent of an X-ray. This was much, much less than something that would have caused health effects. The only health impact of the disaster was the anxiety caused by it, and that anxiety was understandable. There had just been a blockbuster film highlighting the extreme dangers of a meltdown, caused by the very same thing that had caused a partial meltdown in this case. It also suggested that officials might not tell the whole truth, and that there was more to the danger than anybody would reveal. It didn't help when writers working on the film claimed that it was a race to get the film out before such a disaster happened, as they were certain that it would. People believed they were living through the China Syndrome, and years later there was even a lawsuit claiming that the disaster had caused major health effects, but no evidence for this could be found. Years later, industry commentators claimed that the China Syndrome film and the accident that coincidentally took place days later were responsible for a change in public opinion on nuclear power. There were already anti-nuclear protesters, but this coincidence gave them more fuel, and more people believed plants were more dangerous than they really were. Nuclear power became less and less popular, to be replaced by fossil fuel plants, which may not have been that much safer. It's a popular story that ancient Egyptian mummies and tombs were protected by curses, condemning the people who disturbed the lost pharaoh to a dark fate. While there have been some eerie coincidences surrounding certain discoveries, the curse of the pharaoh is nothing more than a myth. But there is at least one series of coincidences that does make it seem like at least one set of objects might be cursed. The objects in question were war trumpets. When Howard Carter excavated the tomb of King Tut in 1922, he uncovered many objects that had never been seen before. Among these were a pair of trumpets, one made from silver and the other from bronze or copper. These are the oldest surviving trumpets ever discovered, and the only ones found from ancient Egypt. It's possible other pharaohs were buried with similar tokens, only for them to be stolen by robbers in antiquity. Archaeologists believed these had some kind of purpose in war and were likely used to organize troops. But it's well known that throughout human history, trumpet-like instruments have been used for spiritual purposes as well. The shrill and loud cries were believed to scare off evil spirits and likely to invoke fear in the hearts of enemies when blown in war. It's believed that these were buried with the pharaoh so that he could command his army in the afterlife. It's not clear exactly how much these were used during King Tut's reign, but they have been used since they were rediscovered. The first confirmed use of the trumpets took place on April 16, 1939. The Egyptian Antiquity Service asked for them to be played on a BBC radio broadcast so people around the world could hear these ancient instruments. Things immediately got off to a bad start, as the silver trumpet cracked during practice. The incident was so distressing to one member of the team that he had to go to the hospital. This alone wasn't too suspicious. After all, these trumpets had gone unused for thousands of years, so they probably weren't in the best condition. But the team decided to go ahead with the broadcast. Just before the broadcast was supposed to begin, there was a power failure throughout Cairo, where the trumpet was to be played. The radio presenter had to read his script by candlelight, but the broadcast went ahead, and millions of people around the world heard the sound of King Tut's ancient war trumpet. It likely didn't play much on anybody's mind. There were many more important things going on to distract them from this light story. But 5 months after the war trumpets were blown, Britain joined the Second World War. The story of the first use of the trumpets would have been enough to convince anyone that they might have been cursed. In reality, it was just a coincidence that the blackout occurred before the broadcast, and that a global war would break out months after the trumpets were heard around the globe. In the decades since, there have been reports of the trumpets being blown 3 more times. The first 2 times, this was attributed to an anonymous student who was doing a report on the artifacts discovered in King Tut's tomb. The student first tried out the trumpet in 1967, likely not thinking much of it. Shortly afterwards, the 6-day war broke out. It was fought primarily on the Sinai Peninsula within Egypt, and thousands of Egyptians lost their lives. In 1991, the trumpet was blown again, possibly by the same student. But this time, the Gulf War would have been well underway, as it started with an invasion by Iraq into Kuwait in August of 1990. The rest of the countries involved, including Egypt, then spent months building up their armed forces, but the second phase of the war started in January of 1991. Details of when the trumpet was blown are unknown. The person who blew the trumpet remains anonymous, and there are little more than a few anecdotes that say it was actually blown. But whether or not the blowing happened before or during the war, it remains an eerie coincidence that the only time anybody decided to use the instrument was around wartime. So far, the last time the trumpets were used is believed to have been in 2011. This time, the person playing the instrument was a member of the museum staff. He was photographing and documenting the collection when he decided to blow the trumpet. Just weeks later, the Egyptian uprising against ruler Hosni Mubarak took place. In the chaos surrounding the revolution, there was a lot of looting, and the museum where the trumpets were being held was one of the places attacked by looters. The trumpets were stolen, causing a great deal of upset for the museum staff. But it wasn't long before they were returned, anonymously and mysteriously. It's possible that the person who stole them learned of their cultural significance and felt bad for taking away history from the country. But it's also possible that they discovered just how dangerous these trumpets were, and thought it was a good idea that they didn't get into the hands of anybody who might use them recklessly. Since then, the trumpets have been kept under lock and key. They've been on tour, visiting other museums as parts of exhibits, but so far, nobody has had the urge to blow into this instrument of war. The story surrounding the trumpets has given rise to the idea that they were cursed. If they were once used to rally armies, it might be that this is still their purpose, whether the musicians meant it or not. It might even be that some unknown power convinces people to blow on the trumpet at just the right time. Trumpets remain a part of apocalypse literature, adding another eerie twist to the story. But it is just a story, and likely nothing more than a coincidence. There have been lots of battles fought in the area that haven't been accompanied by the use of these notorious trumpets. The final 3 uses also remain more speculative than certain, and may have been made up just to help the legend grow. But that doesn't take away from the creepy coincidences that accompanied their first use, though. Thomas Jackson, better known as Stonewall Jackson, got his nickname while fighting at the Battle of Bull Run in Virginia during the American Civil War, when Confederate General Bernard E. Bee was heard yelling at his troops, "There's Jackson standing like a stone wall," but also because the men who served under him were in awe of his courageous and stubborn nature during battle. He also became known as one of the Civil War's most skillful tacticians, but his life would come to a tragic end when he was accidentally fired upon by his own troops on the 2nd of May, 1863, during the Battle of Chancellorsville. He didn't perish on the battlefield, but passed away soon after when the pneumonia hemorrhagic shock set in as a result of the wounds that he sustained during the unfortunate accident. It's considered by many historians to be the turning point of the war. Many people are baffled as to how his own troops could have misidentified him for one of the enemy's soldiers, since this seems quite negligent. But a team of researchers believes they may have finally found the answer to this mystery, and as it turns out, it has a lot to do with the position of the moon on that particular night. The troops under Jackson's command had just celebrated a victory against the 12th Corps, but they had very little time to rest as he ordered his men to keep fighting well after the sun had set that very same day. Visibility would have been very low, with just the light of the moon to light their way, but they battled on regardless, something that wasn't usually done at this time. This is when confusion started to set in, and unbeknownst to Jackson, his fate was sealed. At this point, a Confederate soldier who was riding on the left flank of the 18th North Carolina Regiment mistakenly thought that Jackson and his men were the enemy and that they were about to be attacked. Major John Barry then gave the order to fire at the advancing troops, and Jackson was hit in the wrist as well as his left arm, which in modern times would have been dealt with swiftly, but this was not the case during the times of the American Civil War. The injuries were considered too severe to be successfully treated, and Jackson's arm had to be amputated. Unfortunately, he suffered complications shortly afterward, and contracted pneumonia, which ultimately ended his life just over a week later. Barry, the commander who gave the order to fire upon Jackson and his men, would later speak of the guilt that he felt over the incident. But given the hectic and chaotic nature of the confrontations of the Civil War, many other leaders would have ended up doing the exact same thing, since there was a large element of uncertainty involved, and a decision had to be made in a matter of seconds. To solve this mystery once and for all, Don Olson, an astronomer at Texas State University, and Laurie E. Jasinski, a researcher from the Texas State Historical Association, had to figure out exactly where Jackson and Barry were positioned at around 9 p.m., the moment that the decision was made to fire. They made use of Confederate almanacs, battle maps that were created by military historian Robert Crick, as well as the compass direction of the moon and the lunar phase at that exact time during the battle, and found that the mistake wasn't as unavoidable as some people may think. They discovered that from Barry's perspective, Jackson and his men would have been nothing more than a set of dark silhouettes, making it impossible for them to see any details that would have helped them identify their fellow soldiers. In the heat of the battle, virtually every decision would have had a profound effect on the men under an officer's command, and if that decision isn't made quickly, it could spell disaster and likely cause many lives to be needlessly lost. And so Barry had to decide what the right course of action would be in the situation that he and his men found themselves in. Unfortunately, it was the wrong decision at that moment, but under different circumstances, he may have saved many lives if the advancing regiment had been a group of enemy soldiers instead. Barry and his men would have been remembered ever since as the troop that fired on and ended the life of Stonewall Jackson. But at least now their reputations have been restored somewhat, since many other officers would have given the exact same orders if they were placed in Barry's position. In fact, some historians argue that if he hadn't given the order to fire, it would have been seen as even more negligent. If the approaching silhouettes had actually been enemy soldiers, and the decision to fire wasn't made, many more soldiers would not have lived to see the sunrise the following morning. There's also something to be said about Jackson's decision to keep his men fighting long into the night, when he knew that visibility would be very poor, and the likelihood of a mistake being made would have been much higher than a normal battle during the day. This isn't to say that Jackson's demise was of his own doing, but it is undeniable that if he had chosen to rather fight on the following morning, he may have lived on to see many more battles during the Civil War. Olson had finally solved the puzzle of Jackson's passing, but this isn't the only time that he's unraveled historical mysteries with the use of astronomy. He also discovered that Paul Revere was able to complete his famous ride on the 18th of April, 1775. Some historians were baffled by the fact he wasn't spotted by British soldiers, who were stationed on a ship close to an area where he passed by. And again, it was found to be thanks to the position of the moon. There's still one question that bothers many scholars, but unfortunately we'll never know whether the Battle of Gettysburg would have turned out any differently if Jackson had not been wounded, or if he hadn't succumbed to his injuries. One of the most famous volcanic eruptions in history is that of Mount Vesuvius, which is located in Italy, and erupted at around 1 p.m. on an October afternoon in 79 AD. It brought about a massive amount of destruction, and is thought to have ended the lives of as many as 16,000 people in Pompeii, Herculaneum, and other towns that were close to the volcano to be affected. Most of us are familiar with the strange sight left behind by the blast, the petrified remains of people who lived in Pompeii and who succumbed to the massive amount of ash that was spewed into the air, covering the surrounding area in 19 feet of ash and burying the site for the next few centuries. But not many people are aware that other strange treasures were unearthed when Herculaneum, a town located about 11 miles from Pompeii, was discovered in 1709, quite by accident, when farmers attempted to build a well and found the town buried under their feet. When excavation was then started, archaeologists came across a villa that's thought to have belonged to Julius Caesar's father-in-law, and along with it, they started finding strange lumps of coal that were then thrown away. But they soon realized that these lumps were far more important than they initially thought, when one of the workers at the site noticed that they contained what looked like writing, and instead of getting rid of them, they decided to save them. It was then found that these lumps of coal were in fact papyrus scrolls that had been preserved thanks to carbonization caused by the high temperatures of the volcanic flow and the low oxygen levels below the volcanic ash. Next came the daunting task of unrolling the incredibly fragile scrolls that hadn't been disposed of without damaging them. One man named Antonio Piaggio, who served as the manuscript curator of the Vatican, came up with an ingenious contraption that slowly unwrapped the scrolls at an incredibly slow pace. So slow, in fact, that the first scroll was only fully unwrapped 4 years later. 6 of these scrolls were gifted to Napoleon by King Ferdinand IV, and he in turn handed them over to the Institut de France. In modern times, scientists have struggled to find a way to read the scrolls without damaging them beyond repair. There was some success in 2002 when a professor from the University of Kentucky devised a method by which ancient scrolls could be read with the use of modern technology. The first step was to take a 3D scan of the scroll, after which each individual layer was identified. These layers or pages can then be flattened out virtually, and any leftover remnants of ink can then be identified and properly analyzed. This technique was used on the scrolls found at Herculaneum, and it was uncovered that traces of ink had indeed been found. In 2020, Nat Friedman, the then CEO of GitHub, learned of the Herculaneum scrolls after he became interested in ancient Roman culture. Intrigued by the idea that the scrolls could be opened virtually and read, Friedman announced that a competition would be held to see who could read at least 4 continuous passages of the scrolls first. Whoever achieved this feat would be awarded $700,000, and in March of 2023, the competition was officially underway. News of the competition, known as the Vesuvius Challenge, reached the ears of an intern working for SpaceX, a man named Luke Ferreter, and he was immediately interested. He finished his shift for the day and immediately drove home to read more about the challenge and the strange scrolls that were leaving scholars baffled. He came across findings from another contestant who believed he'd found ink on one of the scrolls while looking at the scans that had been taken. This gave Ferreter a good idea of what to look for, and as he closely scrutinized the rest of the scrolls, he found 10 more letters. Knowing that there was another $40,000 prize on offer to anyone who could find 10 legible letters in a 1.5-inch area of any of the scrolls, he set about finding a way to read more of the text using AI technology. It would eventually be announced that Ferreter had won the $40,000 prize after the AI model found the word purple, and other contestants who'd been working on the same problem were quick to notice. One of these contestants was 26-year-old Youssef Nader, who was studying at university in Berlin. He had also been looking into AI technology to unravel the mysteries held by the scrolls, tweaking his model according to small fragments of text that had previously been found, and he was awarded a prize of $1,500 for his efforts. He then started looking at the same section of the scroll that Ferreter had been working on, and after he found a few more letters, he added them to his AI model, which then revealed even more of the letters, which are currently being translated by experts. The grand prize is still up for grabs, but the prospects of it ever being won are quickly dwindling. The 2 scrolls that are being studied by contestants will likely not hold enough usable material to be read by the AI models, and since the competition closes at the end of 2023, there's virtually no chance of continuous passages of text being identified. But there is hope beyond the Vesuvius Challenge. As AI technology is improved over the coming years, something that's all but destined to happen, these models may be able to identify other areas on the scrolls that contain legible ink, and more of the ancient writings can then hopefully be deciphered. Both Ferreter and Nader have stated that they plan to invest in more computers after winning money from the challenge, since they would like to see what other messages are hidden inside these scrolls that are around 2,000 years old. Ferreter, for one, has stated that after he graduates from university, he would like to continue studying the scrolls, not only because of the prospect of winning the grand prize, but because he's extremely interested in what was written on the papyri and who it was written by. Though the texts may not hold any historically important information, they could still give us valuable insights into the daily lives of the people who lived in the area at that time that Vesuvius erupted. And if nothing else, it'll be very thrilling to read the writings of someone who lived 2,000 years ago. Researchers have now also realized that the virtual unwrapping technology used to find letters on the Herculaneum scrolls could be used on more modern texts that have until now been too damaged or fragile to read. One candidate for this process is the Franklin Papers, which were badly damaged and could contain notes on that famous Arctic expedition. For now, though, it remains a waiting game to see who will be the first to unravel more of the scroll's secrets, but the mystery is slowly unraveling and may finally be completely solved in the near future. Most of us are familiar with the famous novel Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley, in which a Swiss scientist named Victor Frankenstein creates a monster from the body parts of deceased people. When the monster doesn't live up to Frankenstein's expectations, he turns his back on it, causing the monster to go on a murderous rampage. The novel ends in tragedy when Frankenstein passes away and his monster vows to take his own life. It's a story that's been told for many, many years, and it's certain to be told for many more. But there are some details about its creation that have been disputed over the years, one of which focuses on Shelley's inspiration to write it. Shelley was just 18 years old when she wrote the novel in June of 1816, and at the time she was visiting Switzerland along with her husband Percy, her stepsister, Lord Byron, and a man named John Polidori. The setting around the villa was dark and gloomy, with several rain and thunderstorms moving through the area, likely caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora, which resulted in 1816 becoming known as the Year Without Summer. It seemed the perfect setting for a few ghost stories, and each member of the group took turns to read to each other from a collection of German ghost stories that had been translated into French. Lord Byron then came up with a neat idea and suggested that each of the guests write their own ghost story that would be just as enjoyable, if not more so, than the tales in the book that they were reading from. The stories were so vivid that Shelley still remembered most of their details more than a decade and a half later, with two of the stories in particular standing out, namely the history of the inconstant lover and the tale of the sinful founder of his race. But this is where the details get a little murky. Most scholars maintain that this challenge was set on the 16th of June, and that Shelley then produced her story the very next day. But according to Shelley, she struggled to come up with an idea for several days after the challenge had been set, leading many scholars to believe that her version of events is in fact untrue. Shelley claimed that after days of struggling to find inspiration for a story, she was up past midnight having a philosophical discussion with one of her fellow guests. When she'd had enough, she decided to go to bed, but she struggled with nightmares in which a male figure attempted to bring a corpse back to life with the use of his scientific knowledge. She woke from the dream with a start and saw that the moon was shining brightly into her window. She had found the inspiration she needed and immediately started writing her famous work, Frankenstein, later recounting the evening by writing, quote, "What terrified me will terrify others, and I need only describe the specter that had haunted my midnight pillow." According to a diary kept by Polidori, he was the one who hadn't started his story by morning after the challenge had been set, but according to Shelley, she hadn't started writing hers until days after, leaving scholars with a perplexing discrepancy. Some people believe she made her version of events up in hopes that her novel would sell more copies, and that she actually started writing the story immediately after going to her room that night. Unfortunately, Polidori doesn't mention the exact date that the challenge was set in his diary, and it had always just been assumed that this was done on the 16th of June, since his entry about not starting his story was dated the 17th. What is known is that the challenge was definitely set by Byron, and that he, along with Polidori, arrived at the villa on the 10th. This means that the challenge had to have been set between the 10th and the 16th. There are, however, further clues that help narrow the dates down. Since Shelley mentioned the moon shining in through her window on that night in June, researchers knew that they could rely on the position of the moon relative to the villa to pin down the exact dates. In August of 2010, a group of astronomers from Texas State University traveled to Villa Diodati, where they made notes about the villa's position, as well as the position of Shelley's window and the terrain surrounding the building. From here, they had the task of determining the position of the moon during the time that the four guests were staying at the villa. And to do this, they scoured through weather records for the entire month of June 1816. They found that the moon would have indeed been shining brightly during the early morning hours at the time, and it would have cleared a nearby hill just before 2 a.m. as it rose on the 16th of June. This would mean that Byron had likely suggested the challenge between the 10th and the 13th of June rather than the 16th, as was previously believed. It also proved that she had indeed stayed up past midnight on the 15th while she was involved in a philosophical discussion. If the challenge had been set on the 13th, It would mean that Shelley struggled for 3 days before she saw a beam of light shining through her window, and that she would have started the novel on the 16th. Donald Olson, a Texas State University faculty member, stated that he had always been curious about Shelley's claims, and that he'd always hoped to recreate the exact circumstances of that evening when Shelley was struck by inspiration to write one of the most famous horror novels in all of history. The team was aware that there was another version of events that took place inside the villa. Some people suggested that Byron actually set the challenge on the 16th and that Shelley only started writing her story on the 22nd. But this would have been impossible, as it's now been discovered that there would not have been sufficient moonlight on that evening, and that Shelley would not have seen the moon shining in through her window on that particular date. And so it seems that the mystery surrounding Shelley's claims had finally been solved, and that she'd been telling the truth all along. It should be noted that she wasn't the only author to pen a famous story during the group's time at the villa. Although Polidori had been struggling to come up with his own story, as is evidenced by his diary entries, he would eventually also find inspiration and pen the famous short story The Vampire, resulting in the first ever tale in the English language that centered on a terrifying subject of vampires. Shelley's novel would become a roaring success when it was published 2 years later, and at first she was hesitant to come forward as its author, given the macabre subject matter that the story focused on. This led many people to believe that her husband, Percy, had actually written the story, but this theory has been disproven since Shelley's notes show that Percy merely served as an editor during its creation. Quite unbelievably, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein still sells as many as 40,000 copies every year, a remarkable feat given that it was written over 200 years ago. Egyptian history is steeped in mystery, and thanks to this, many people believe that archaeological sites found there have a special significance, particularly that some of the ancient structures in the country have some connection to the paranormal extraterrestrial beings of energies that only the ancient Egyptians knew how to use. There are also rumors that some of the tombs that have been found in Egypt contain mummies that will curse anyone who opens them, or that some of the relics found inside these tombs also hold terrible curses. This is, of course, the stuff of fiction, since no solid proof has ever been found that anyone working on these sites has ever been truly cursed in any way. Deaths that occurred after viewing or working on these items have been explained as having nothing to do with anything paranormal. And yet these rumors persist today, as more artifacts are extracted from the ground, some of which have left researchers and archaeologists baffled. Some of these theories stem from a misunderstanding of the hieroglyphs that were used by ancient Egyptians, many of which are still being discovered at new dig sites today. And although they seem to depict one thing, they usually mean another. One such hieroglyph has kept people scratching their heads since it was discovered in the Temple of Seti, at the archaeological site of the ancient city of Abydos, which is situated on the west bank of the Nile River. The city is considered to be one of the most important Egyptian discoveries ever made. During its heyday, the city would have served as a cemetery during the First and Second dynasties, after which it served as an area where people could pray to the god Osiris, with people traveling from far and wide to do so. But in modern times, the site is best known for the hieroglyphs that have been discovered there, known as the Abydos carvings. Conspiracy theorists often refer to the carvings as the helicopter hieroglyphs, and at a glance it's easy to see why. On one set of hieroglyphs, it was noted that some of the characters resembled machinery from the modern era, specifically a helicopter, 2 planes, a submarine, and rather more outlandishly, an extraterrestrial craft. One well-known ufologist, Steve Mera, who serves as the chairman of Manchester's Association of Paranormal Investigation and Training, stated at a UFO conference held in London that the helicopter hieroglyph clearly depicts a machine with a rudder and a set of rotor blades, as would be found on a helicopter. He insists that these carvings were made after a visit from extraterrestrial beings, since he believes the ancient Egyptians couldn't possibly have carved these images without seeing these machines with their own eyes. Some people have speculated that these characters could be considered out-of-place artifacts that have no explanation, since the ancient Egyptians surely could not have had knowledge of these items. This has given rise to a whole slew of further conspiracy theories that include suggestions that the ancient Egyptians were visited by extraterrestrials, who either told them about these machines or demonstrated how they were to be used. It's also been suggested that these extraterrestrials had a hand in building the Great Pyramids and other notable structures, either by using unknown technology to move the massive stones used in their construction, or by providing the ancient Egyptians with that same technology that allowed them to move the stones themselves. Some people have even gone so far as to claim that these hieroglyphs don't actually exist, and that the photos depicting them have been faked, though it's uncertain why an archaeologist would choose to do this. Another theory that's been put forward is that the ancient Egyptians were visited by people from the future, and that these visitors brought the machinery seen in the hieroglyphs with them to aid in the construction of various sites around Egypt. Why a time traveler would choose to visit Egypt rather than any other area on Earth is unknown, which is unsurprising given that these theories often offer very little as far as solid and undeniable proof is concerned. But the true explanation for these characters is far more logical. It is well known that a newly appointed pharaoh would often have new hieroglyphs carved over those left behind by the previous pharaoh, and it's also known that this process took place at the Temple of Seti in Abydos, where the helicopter hieroglyphs were discovered. The section of the temple that contains these hieroglyphs was built during the reign of Seti I, but when Ramses II took over, he had his own set of hieroglyphs added over those left by Seti I. This resulted in the characters becoming distorted over time, and what is seen by modern humans as a helicopter, a plane, or a submarine was initially carved to depict something entirely different. But many people have refused to accept this explanation, since similar carvings have been discovered in the Amon-Ra temple in Karnak, which is situated near Luxor in Egypt. They claim that it would be virtually impossible for two separate palimpsests to result in the same images, and that the hieroglyphs clearly show modern machinery that should not have been around at that time. It's also been suggested that the images are a result of a mistake made by the person who carved them. One blogger speculates that one pharaoh's name had been carved into the stone erroneously, and the carver then tried to rectify his mistake by simply carving the correct name over the first. They suggest that as time passed and the images eroded, the result was an image that resembled a helicopter and other modern pieces of machinery. They go on to explain that what looks like a helicopter or a submarine to modern humans would have likely depicted something far more mundane to the people who carved them, such as a body part, an animal, or a notable event that had taken place. The fact that extraterrestrials, modern machinery, and the like aren't mentioned in any other ancient Egyptian writing all but debunks this outlandish theory that they were in any way involved in the lives of the people who created the puzzling hieroglyphs, or that they had a hand in creating these ancient buildings. When the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799, it made it possible for archaeologists and historians to decode thousands of the hieroglyphs found at these ancient sites, none of which made any mention of alien beings, time travelers, or machinery from the future. Since the ancient Egyptians prided themselves on keeping records of every notable event, it seems highly unlikely that they would have been chosen to omit an event such as being visited by a race from another planet, or receiving help from someone who could travel through time. The mystery has now finally been solved, and although we don't know exactly what these hieroglyphs are meant to depict, we can rest easy with the knowledge that they have nothing to do with modern machinery, time travel, or aliens from beyond the stars. Metal detecting is a hobby practiced by hundreds of thousands of people all over the world, some of whom take it very seriously as they hunt for the treasures that have been lost or left behind by others. 48-year-old Buffy Bailey, a National Health Service nurse from Lancashire in England, is one such enthusiast, along with her husband, 59-year-old Ian. The couple is in the habit of traveling all around the country with their metal detectors, and in 2021, they decided to visit York while on vacation. Buffy says they chose this area because it has a lot of history, making it more likely that they could stumble upon an artifact or something of interest to historians. They've made reservations to stay at a farm in the area, and as soon as they arrived, the owner asked whether they would like to go out detecting. The couple was more than ready and headed out immediately, doing their best to avoid fellow vacationers in the area, since they've been known to interrupt their detecting sessions with silly questions about what they managed to find so far. Buffy was walking along a footpath when her metal detector suddenly indicated that there was something beneath the soil. She didn't expect to find anything out of the ordinary, given that they were on a farm, and there were likely many pieces of metal that had been covered by dirt over time. She assumed that when she dug down to find them, it would likely be an ear tag that had been lost by a sheep, or something even more common, like a pull tab from a can of beer or soda. Nevertheless, she dug down about 5 inches to see what she could find, and to her surprise, it was something she'd never seen before, but she still didn't think it would be anything special. She then proceeded to remove as much of the dirt from the object as she could, and that's when she realized this was no ordinary find. It looked like a small book, and at first she assumed it must have fallen off of someone's charm bracelet, but it seemed heavier than a normal charm. She then used her phone to take a photo of the small book, and when she zoomed in on this image, she realized that it was made of gold. She called Ian, who was searching in an adjacent field, to come and fetch her because she was so shocked at the discovery that she found herself frozen in place. But it would be another hour before he did so. Realizing that the small book would be historically significant, the couple took it to the Richard III Society, and it's currently being held by the Yorkshire Museum, where it's being studied by historians after it was found to be internationally important. It's since attracted the attention of historians from around the world, who have stated that the 2 figures engraved on the book's open pages are without a doubt St. Leonard and St. Margaret, the patron saints of childbirth. It's thought that the book would have been owned by someone during the 1400s, and that they likely carried it with them as a form of protection during pregnancy. This is all the more likely given the fact that between 40 and 60% of women didn't survive childbirth during that period. It's also been suggested that the tiny book may have originally been part of a birthing girdle, or that it may simply be a bookmark used by people to keep their place while reading the Bible. Historians are very excited about the discovery, since nothing like it has ever been found. It's believed that the owner of the book must have been very well off, since it's made of gold and would have been specially commissioned. It's been estimated to be worth as much as £100,000, or $125 US. One expert named Julian Evan Hart has dated the book to between 1280 and 1410. Given that it was illegal for anyone except members of royalty to carry gold at that time, it seems likely that the book's owner was very important indeed. It's also been suggested that it was created by the same craftsperson that made the Middleham Jewel, which was also discovered by a metal detector enthusiast in 1985, since the 2 objects have remarkably similar engravings, though the latter contains imagery of Jesus' crucifixion, the Nativity, and the 15 saints. The jewel was also believed to protect its wearer, and it would enhance their prayers against physical ailments that included ulcers, headaches, stammers, and failing eyesight. This item would have belonged to someone of the upper classes, since similar items are often seen in depictions of late 15th century noblewomen, usually worn on necklaces. It's also been suggested that the Middleham Jewel protected its wearer against difficult childbirth, as is the case with Buffy's book. There is a very real possibility that these treasures were lost by their wearers and that this would have been a very tragic event for them. But some scholars suggest that they may have been buried in these areas on purpose, either because a child was born without any complications or the opposite, that the grief of losing a child during labor would have been too much to bear. It's also possible that the book belonged to someone of a lower class, who then buried it as a precautionary measure, since they would have gotten into a lot of trouble if they were caught carrying an item made of gold, or depicting religious imagery during the English Reformation. Some scholars have even suggested that the book and the Middleham Jewel were owned by the same person, and that they hid the items in order to retrieve them for later, but for some unknown reason were unable to do so. After its discovery, some people thought that the book was meant to be a representation of the Bible, but this is very unlikely, since it was tradition to have the words "in the beginning" engraved onto any piece of jewelry or art that had anything to do with the Bible. What needs to be done next is to attempt to identify the person that the tiny book belonged to, which is a formidable task in itself. Whether or not this will be possible remains to be seen, since the piece is beyond rare, and it'll be very difficult to trace its origins. Once the book has been thoroughly studied by historians at the Yorkshire Museum, it can either be purchased by the museum or returned to Buffy. any monetary gains from the sale of the book will be divided up between Buffy and the owner of the farm where it was unearthed. It's a very unlikely discovery that is not likely to be repeated anytime soon, but it's one that'll keep historians busy for some time to come. Some of the strangest and most captivating mysteries are those that involve unknown languages. Throughout history, countless writing systems or proto-writing systems have been developed. Some go on to evolve into the languages we know today, while others fade out of usage and leave behind mysterious works that leave future scholars scratching their heads. Of the many mysterious languages and writing systems out there, there are a few artifacts that capture the imagination more than most. Old books or codexes, filled with undeciphered languages and strange images, draw scholars in with the promise of being the first to solve something historically significant. The Rahang Codex is one such mysterious book, though one that doesn't get as much attention as others. The Codex is a book made up of 448 paper pages that measure 12 by 10 centimeters. Some pages at the start and end of the book have come loose, and the leather binding is also significantly damaged. But for the most part, the text is in a relatively good condition, considering its apparent age. But other than what the book physically looks like, not a whole lot is known about it. It first appeared on the historical scene in 1838, when a man named Gustav Battiani donated the contents of his personal library to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Battiani was a Hungarian count and later the 5th Prince of Battiani-Stratman. He and his family played important political roles, and Gustav was part of the Hungarian national movement. A book that possibly showed how Hungarian culture had been present in the area for 1,000 years would have been extremely important to him. He would move to England not long after his donation and deal with racehorses. But by donating such a large number of books to the Academy of Sciences, his impact on Hungarian culture lived on. Among the many books in his collection was the Rahang Codex, named after the location of the library. If Battiani knew anything about the origin of the Codex, he didn't pass that information on to the people who took in his collection. They were left to try to solve the puzzle themselves. There was a possible reference to the book in a 1743 catalog of the Battiani Library, which described a Hungarian prayer book which matched the size of the Codex. No other details were given, and it's impossible to say for certain that this was the same book, but it's possible that the Codex was seen as a prayer book. Of course, what makes the book so mysterious is that nobody is able to read the contents. Each page is covered in writing in some unknown script. It seems to have been written from right to left, as the right-hand margin is straight. The characters are a mix of curved and straight, which resembled Hungarian script at the time, but it was very obvious to readers that this wasn't Hungarian. For starters, there were far too many letters. Scholars identified almost 800 different characters, more than any local alphabet. In fact, no writing system in the world had a similar number of characters. Most either had far fewer, like typical alphabets, or far more, like the Chinese writing system. It would be easy to dismiss the book as nonsense, but the writing followed a structure that implied it was genuine writing. It had meant something to whoever wrote it. They had also written it with confidence that implied they were fluent in it. This wasn't the case of someone making up a language. It's possible that some clues could be found in the images featured in the book. These appeared to show stories from the Bible, but there were also Islamic and Hindu influences. Other images showed battles that may have been historical rather than religious. The images suggested that the book originated somewhere where all three religions had some kind of influence, while the style of the images implied that they were hundreds of years old. The leather binding on the book was added much later than the pages, which meant it was useless at providing any sort of origin story for the Codex. But the pages themselves could be more useful. Each page had a watermark, which showed an anchor inside a circle inside a star with 6 rays. Old paper manufacturers would include watermarks on their paper as sort of a brand. This one indicated that the paper came from a Venetian manufacturer between 1529 and 1540. Unfortunately, that doesn't answer many questions. Those who argue that the Codex is a modern fake, or a 19th century fake at least, can claim that the paper was sourced from an antique dealer. Those who believe in an older source can claim that the Codex was a 16th century copy of an older text. There was a fair amount of debate in the 19th century about the origin of the Codex, but Hungarian scholars would eventually come to the consensus that it was a then modern forgery. Modern technology may be helpful in cracking the code, with early AI having already been used to try to decipher it. But even that is the first part of the puzzle. As one scholar who worked on the Codex pointed out, even if it is found to be a fake, the question of who faked it and why remains. If it's found to be accurate, then there will be questions about how this mysterious language came to Hungary, and if it exists anywhere else in the world. For the first few centuries after the time of Jesus, Christianity looked a lot different to what it looks like today. There were lots of different interpretations of things like the Trinity and the dual nature of Christ. For a lot of Christians, attacking other Christians and making sure their own interpretation of religion survived was an important part of the survival of the whole religion. There are many apocryphal books, or books that didn't make it into the Bible, during the councils that decided what was church doctrine. If a book didn't make it in, the followers of this style of Christianity risked being banished from the Roman Empire, and even lost their lives. Some of these books still managed to survive, either in smaller churches outside the Roman Empire, or secreted away, only to be discovered centuries later. When these books are found, they can attract a wave of attention in the media. It's claimed that they tell a new, untold version of the biblical story. Normally, these gospels differ only slightly, or in ways related to something spiritual, and it's not much of importance other than to biblical scholars. But one strange discovery in the 1970s drew much more attention. The Codex Gigas is a papyrus discovered near Elmina in Egypt. The exact location where it was found and the date remains a mystery. This wasn't found in some official dig, but was liberated by antique hunters. It spent a few years being passed around on the gray market, with people not understanding the importance of the ancient artifact. It wouldn't be until 2001 when the owner of the Codex, Frida Nussberger Gigas, donated it to the Foundation of Ancient Art in Bern, Switzerland. By that point, the Codex was badly damaged. It likely hadn't been in too bad of a condition when it was originally discovered, but the handling in the 30 years since had taken its toll on the artifact. At one point, it was frozen for some reason. During the defrosting, a decay began to set in, and parts of the top layers of the papyrus began to flake off. By the time it was given to the museum, it was in thousands of pieces. Parts of the Codex had also disappeared. At one point, one of the buyers had been unable to pay for the artifact but was already in possession of it. He was ordered to return the ancient pages, but it seems he kept a few for himself. Some of these would later be found in private collections. When the Codex finally landed in academic hands, translation work began. The text was written in Egyptian Coptic language, so translation wasn't as hard as other long-lost texts. What researchers found was amazing. The Codex was split into 4 parts. There was a letter from Peter to Philip and the first Apocalypse of James, both of which had been found in other Coptic manuscripts. The last part was the most damaged and seemed to be a unique book called the Book of Stranger. This seems to have been related to another Coptic text previously found, but it wasn't the exact same. The third part of the Codex was the most interesting though. It was called the Gospel of Judas. For almost 2,000 years, the characterization of Judas has been pretty consistent. The story of Judas's betrayal is one of the most well-known stories in the Bible. Judas was one of Jesus' 12 apostles and was a close follower, but he was convinced to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver and turn Jesus over to the authorities. But the Gospel of Judas tells a very different version of this story. Judas did not betray Jesus, but was actually his closest confidant. Jesus revealed to Judas secrets of heaven and spirituality and requested that Judas turn him into authorities. According to the Gospel, Jesus said, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." As well as portraying Judas in a more friendly light, the most important part of the text is how the material world is portrayed. Researchers believe that this is a Gnostic text. These believers saw the spiritual world as good and the material world that we live in as corrupt. The belief system differs significantly from what we know in Christianity today, with lesser gods and other more spiritual elements. Judas's role wasn't about making Jesus a martyr, but destroying the corrupt material body to release the spiritual part of Jesus. This was very controversial, even in the early days of Christianity. Interestingly, scholars knew about the Gospel of Judas long before it was uncovered. In the year 180, the bishop and Christian writer Irenaeus wrote a piece called Against Heresies, where he condemned the Gospel of Judas as fiction and blamed the writing of this gospel on Canaanite Gnostics. Scholars believe that the gospel would have been written in the mid-2nd century and would have been relatively well spread by the time Irenaeus wrote about it. However, the Codex Gigas is dated to between 310 and 403 AD. Scholars believe that this codex was a Coptic translation of an earlier text that likely would have been written in Greek. There is some debate about the translation of the text. Some believe that instead of Judas being a secret ally, the gospel actually portrays Judas as a demon. That comes from one word, daemon, which could either mean demon or 13th god. How the demonic interpretation of the text fits together is less clear, especially as it's most likely the Gnostic text that Irenaeus wrote about. The text is still being debated among scholars, though it's generally accepted that this wasn't a piece of historical writing. Its writing suggests knowledge of other gospels, distancing it from the time of Jesus. It doesn't seem to be pulling from earlier sources either, though. The text was written to make a theological point rather than a historical one. Another interesting mystery is what exactly was contained in the Book of Stranger. With small fragments being found over the years, it's possible we might one day be able to piece together this story, but for now, it remains unsolved. When someone is kidnapped for ransom, there are normally 3 scenarios that might play out. The first is that everything goes to plan, the ransom is paid, and the kidnapped person is released. Sometimes the police manage to rescue the kidnapped person without any money ever being paid. And there are the less fortunate cases where the victim has their life taken. But the case of Casper Holstein was unique in that none of these 3 things happened, and the case had a happy if strange ending. Holstein himself wasn't a typical person. Born in 1876 in the Dutch West Indies, he and his mother moved to New York when he was 8 years old. He grew up in Brooklyn and joined the US Navy when he graduated. Holstein fought the First World War and was briefly stationed in the US Virgin Islands, the old Dutch West Indies. When he returned to New York, he began working as a janitor and a doorman before becoming a messenger for a broker on Wall Street. Holstein was very intelligent and learned a lot about the stock market. This was decades before any major company would hire an African-American stockbroker, and given the time period, there were actually better ways for Holstein to use his intelligence to make money. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, a sort of lottery was common in a number of American cities with poor populations. New York was no different. Between 1905 and 1915, that lottery was run by Peter Matthews in Harlem. The game was sometimes called the Numbers or Numbers Game, and consisted of picking 3 numbers and placing a small amount of money on it. Given that the odds were 999 to 1 on that number being picked, it could lead to a windfall if the number was chosen. Under Matthews, it was a fairly corrupt system. He controlled who found out what the winning numbers were and could easily change them. But in 1915, he was arrested for running this illegal gambling ring. In 1923, Holstein would be one of the people responsible for bringing it back. Holstein had a new system and would use numbers from the New York Stock Exchange, US Customs House receipts, and horse betting handles to determine the winning number. All of these would be published in the newspaper, which meant that anybody could see if they had won or not. The game was immensely popular. It earned Holstein the nickname Boltia King and around $2 million, the equivalent of around $36 million in today's money. Holstein would use that money to improve the lives of other African Americans, as well as set up a hurricane relief fund for the Virgin Islands. He also set up legitimate businesses. But the money also attracted unwanted attention. In 1927, Holstein was in Chicago when he was held up. He had $30,000 with him at the time. He would later tell a newspaper that the criminals weren't after anything in the club he was visiting. They had come specifically for him. But the crime that would put him back in the spotlight occurred on September 20th, 1928. It was about midnight, and Holstein was walking along the streets of Harlem. He had gone to visit a friend only to find the friend wasn't home, so he was walking to another location. A car pulled up alongside him with 5 white men and 2 white women inside. 2 of the men pretended to be police officers and told Holstein they needed to speak to him at the station about something. Holstein didn't resist and told them he would be willing to go with them. They attacked him anyway. Holstein passed out at one point and was taken to an unknown location. He was held there for hours but was treated well by his kidnappers. At one point, he was given a meal but turned it down as he was on a milk diet. The kidnappers then brought him some milk. At one point during the ordeal, Holstein was moved to another location nearby. He was blindfolded during the journey but could tell it was only a short trip. Later, he would be moved back to the first location. Meanwhile, a ransom had been issued to Holstein's friends, requesting $50,000. The cash that Holstein had with him at the time, as well as his watch and ring, were worth $2,000. But after 3 days, Holstein was released. His captors said that there had been a mistake. He was blindfolded again and taken to Amsterdam Avenue, where he was dropped off at 2 a.m. The men even gave him back his watch and ring and gave him $3 for a taxi home, but he instead went to one of the clubs that he owned. Police estimated that for all the trouble they went through, the kidnappers had earned just $69. No money from the ransom had been paid, and there was no explanation for why Holstein had been let go. The police believed that they had caught some of the criminals responsible. They had been looking for Holstein while he had been kidnapped. However, they had been told that he would be harmed if the search continued, so it was called off. Now that Holstein was safe, they were trying to solve the crime. Holstein was brought in to look at a police lineup, only to claim that he didn't recognize any of the men there, with the exception of one African American in the lineup. But Holstein identified him as a friend named Rudolph Brown. That didn't stop the police from bringing the 2 men to court, including Brown. It was alleged that Brown had sold out his friends to the white kidnappers, but there was no evidence against Brown or the other defendant, Mo Schubert, and the case was dismissed. Nobody would ever be brought to justice for the kidnapping. One newspaper reporter asked Holstein how it was possible he had spent 3 days with the men and didn't recognize any of them. Holstein had cryptically said that he could but couldn't. The reporter took that to mean that he knew who had attacked him, but was keeping it to himself for business reasons. Over the years, there have been many suspects in the case. Years later, a white courthouse attorney named Dixie Davis decided he wanted to take over the numbers game. He had represented many African American mobsters and decided this was a better way to make money. He brought in the mobster Dutch Schultz. Holstein wasn't the only person running numbers games. Many, including Holstein, gave in without a fight. Holstein believed violence would take away from the social and political causes he was championing, so gave up his racket to focus on other ventures. Some believe that either Davis or Schultz were responsible for the kidnapping. This doesn't really seem to line up with how either of them operated, and it would be years after the kidnapping that either tried to move in on Holstein's business. Others believe that it might have been orchestrated by one of Holstein's competitors at the time. His main competitor in Harlem was Stephanie St. Clair, an African-American woman who would later be one of the few to resist Schultz's takeover. She was very intelligent and a confident woman, who also claimed to have invented the same system that Holstein used. But again, there would be no evidence that she or any of Holstein's other competitors had anything to do with it. This answer wouldn't explain why they gave up without getting the ransom either. Anyone who wanted to take over Holstein's business wouldn't have bothered to call for a ransom. They would only alert his friends that there was definitely something wrong, rather than it taking a few days for them to realize he was missing. It also would have made it obvious that any changes of ownership happened under duress. There were no changes in ownership though, and the kidnapping didn't seem to have any impact on Holstein's business. Holstein would later be arrested in 1937 and was imprisoned for a time. After his release, he left the numbers game and led a quiet life before passing away in 1944. He would never reveal who the kidnappers were or why they wanted him, and the strange mystery will likely never be solved. It can be easy to underestimate just how horrific the retreat of Napoleon's Grand Army was from Russia.
380,000 men lost their lives in a campaign that saw very little fighting, as disease, hunger, and exposure destroyed the army. It's unsurprising that during the horrific ordeal, countless stolen artifacts were abandoned, with their locations lost to history. As well as being a formidable general and conqueror, Napoleon Bonaparte cared a lot about his image. During his early expeditions to Egypt, he brought with him scholars and artists to help capture his campaign and to study any ancient Egyptian finds. Both modern and ancient treasures were looted from Egypt. Some had historical significance, like the Rosetta Stone, while other treasures were simply treasury gold and jewels that Napoleon's wife had requested. It wasn't only Egypt where this happened. Egypt wasn't even the first time Napoleon's army had conducted such raids, with Malta having gone through much the same. Throughout Napoleon's conquest of Europe, he brought back treasures from around the continent to France. Thousands of paintings and statues were stolen, including the famous horses of St. Mark. When Napoleon began his ill-fated invasion of Russia, its art was supposed to be added to Napoleon's collection. By 1812, the coalition of countries against Napoleon had learned that they couldn't defeat him in combat. The only way to beat Napoleon was to not fight him. So when he began the invasion of Russia, a scorched earth policy was put into place. The land that France's Grand Army would be marching through wouldn't provide them with anything they needed to survive. That didn't stop the advance though, and before long the army arrived in Moscow. But Moscow had been abandoned and much of the city destroyed by fire. For the next month, Napoleon's army pillaged the city while waiting for a response from the Russian Tsar. Orthodox churches are known for their beautiful architecture and interiors, and those in Moscow were no different. The army wasted no time before they began pulling the golden ornaments and icons out of the churches. Most were melted down into bars with the letter N stamped onto them. Among the stolen items was a gold cross from the Kremlin's Ivan the Great bell tower. Napoleon wanted to place it on top of the national residence of the Invalids in Paris. After a month with no response from the Russian Tsar, Napoleon decided it was time to leave Moscow. He initially led his troops in a march out of the city. It wasn't long before he left them though, rushing ahead to secure his position back in Paris. The soldiers were left with 200 horse-drawn carts of treasure. None of it would ever make it back to Paris. Winter came early that year, and it came suddenly. Great snowstorms covered the land and hid ditches that soldiers would stumble into and were unable to get out. The army was already significantly weakened by disease. In particular, typhus fever had swept through the army while in Moscow, and many were still suffering. As the retreat got further and further from Moscow, more and more soldiers found themselves unable to walk or carry the vast amount of treasure they had taken from Russia. The cold, disease, and hunger were the main causes of casualties. But there were also Cossacks, who conducted guerrilla warfare. They might not have been able to go up against Napoleon's army in battle, but in this particular style of warfare, they could pick off soldiers and whittle down those who were still able to fight. Other tragedies included the crossing of a river, where the bridge was destroyed and people lost their lives trying to cross any way they could. Those who were injured had to be left behind. One of the soldiers would later write that those left behind were only deathly white faces and stiffened hands stretching out towards us. It wasn't only the soldiers that were suffering though. The animals that they had brought with them were also paying a heavy price for Napoleon's decision to stay in Russia. Some were the victims of the same issues the soldiers faced. Others were the victims of starving soldiers. When what remained of the Grand Army returned to Paris, they returned missing most of what they left Moscow with. It wasn't just the treasure that had been left behind. Even their own weapons had been abandoned, as they were too heavy to carry. The failed Russian campaign was the beginning of the end for Napoleon, and his reign in France ended in April of 1814. It wasn't long after Napoleon was defeated that the search for the lost treasure in Russia began. Some of the soldiers who had survived the retreat asked to be allowed to travel to Russia to search for the treasure. They were permitted, but none were able to recover anything. Over the next few decades, there were reports of hordes of French coins being uncovered, but it still wasn't the bulk of what had been stolen from Moscow. Later, a member of Napoleon's staff named Philippe de Ségur claimed he knew where the treasure had been buried. De Ségur had been in the army but became a historian during his retirement.
He wrote the history of Napoleon and the Grand Army during the year 1812. In his account, he wrote how the decision was made while the army was in a small village to throw away anything they didn't need. That included cannons, ancient weapons, gold, and jewels. It was all thrown into the lake in the hopes that they would be able to survive without the baggage weighing them down. 200 years have passed since rumors that the lake was filled with gold began to spread, and naturally, lots of people have searched the area for the gold and other treasures. At that time, a large cache of soldiers' weapons and other mundane items were found, but nothing that resembled the stolen treasure. It was especially significant to the Soviets, who searched many times for gold in the 1970s. Geologists and geophysicists identified two anomalies at the lake, one on the shore and one beneath the water. A dig at the first location revealed nothing, while a dig at the second revealed a large stone. More recently, other locations have been put forward, including Lake Bolshaya Ravech. It's alleged that the soldiers built a walkway into the lake and buried the treasure in the center. That walkway has since washed away, but the treasure remains, though no sign of it has ever been found. It's also possible, and even likely, that the treasure wasn't buried in one cache. Instead, as horses and men collapsed, their luggage was left wherever it lay. The soldiers didn't have the time or energy to dig a great hiding spot for the treasure. Escaping with their lives would have been more of a priority than making sure the treasure was hidden. It's possible that it was recovered not long after it was lost by people who didn't realize its significance or didn't want their windfall to be taken away from them. The possibility hasn't stopped treasure hunters and those interested in history from trying to solve the mystery and find this great hoard of treasure. The Huns had an enormous impact on the history of Europe, leading to the creation of places like Venice and contributing to the downfall of the Western Roman Empire. Under King Attila, they ravaged some of the most well-defended cities in Italy, but they never attempted to sack the city of Rome. The reason why remains a mystery. For the Roman Empire, the Huns were an ominous threat that they knew of long before the armies even attempted to cross their borders. The Huns came from somewhere in the east, though exactly where remains a mystery, even to modern historians. As they swept through Eastern Europe, they were unstoppable. Tribes that had lived in relative peace with the Romans for hundreds of years were now crossing the borders into Roman lands. They were looking for places to settle after being pushed off their own land by people fleeing the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic people, well equipped for fighting on horseback. The armies of the European kingdoms were little match to them, and were unable to replicate their fighting style. By 395, the Romans were already well aware of their enemy, and knew they wouldn't be able to defeat them in battle, so instead the emperor would abandon land to them and pay them to go away. This worked well for the Huns, who got incredibly wealthy from the Eastern Romans, learned more about how their enemy fought, and now had jumping off points to go further west. They constantly ignored treaties that the Romans offered to try to get peace from their new neighbors, and there didn't seem to be anything anyone could do to stop them. In 434, Attila came to power, first as a co-monarch with his brother, and then as the sole ruler from 445. He would become one of the most well-known Huns, and earned countless legends that make his true character somewhat mysterious. At some point, he earned the title of the Scourge of God, and it would be one that suited him well. But Attila didn't do as much sacking and pillaging as we think of today. It seems more likely that we subconsciously associate everything the Huns did with Attila, rather than only what happened during his rule. But it would be during his rule that the Huns would take on the Western Roman Empire. In 450, a woman named Honoria wrote to Attila. She was the sister of Emperor Valentinian III, and had been betrothed to a Roman senator. She was not happy with this arrangement and sent Attila her wedding ring as a symbol of this. Some sources claim the letter was actually a love letter, and Honoria was asking the Hun king to marry her. Others suggested that this was just how Attila read it, and she really just wanted his help escaping her marriage. Either way, he accepted her proposal, and requested half the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. When the emperor denied that request, Attila settled on taking it all. He first marched into Gaul and was met by a combined army of Romans, Goths, Franks, Saxons, and other tribes. They would finally manage to defeat the Scourge of God in battle, but the war was not over. In 452, Attila took his army over the Alps and into Italy itself. The city of Aquileia was utterly destroyed. The survivors fled into the islands and lagoons off the coast and would form Venice. Milan, Verona, and Padua were also sacked, though managed to survive. Attila and his army destroyed many places in northern Italy on their march south and to Rome itself. The coalition army that had pushed the Huns out of Gaul wasn't coming to Rome's aid, so the emperor tried something else. He sent out 3 men to try to persuade Attila not to go any further. Miraculously, Attila left. After the meeting with the 3 ambassadors, Attila turned his army around and left Italy. The Huns returned to Hungary, and Attila would pass away in March of the following year. The reason for this is greatly debated by historians. Naturally, the church claims that it was Leo's words alone that made the Scourge of God turn away. There's no official record of what Leo said to Attila, but there is a speech recorded in legend. Leo told Attila how Rome had once been a conqueror but now had been conquered and was asking for mercy from him. The speech ended with, "The people have felt your scourge. Now they would feel your mercy." According to legend, Attila told his advisors that he saw 2 giants standing behind Leo that he somehow knew were the apostles Peter and Paul. They wielded weapons and commanded that he did what Leo asked. Most people don't believe that Leo's words alone were responsible for Attila turning around, if they had any impact at all. Some state that it was hunger that turned the Huns around. There had been a famine in Italy in the previous years, and the Huns were supposedly struggling to live off the land during their campaign. But other historians have debated this, saying there was no evidence that the army was struggling for food. Another possibility is that the Huns had always intended to go back to Hungary for the winter, and wanted to leave early to avoid outbreaks of disease that were always common in Italy during the autumn. They had planned to return the following spring, but Attila wouldn't live that long. In both of these cases, it seems strange that Attila marched his army down to Rome if he hadn't intended to stay. It's possible he saw the 3 men as an indication that Rome would try to hold out, and he didn't want to waste the time on a lengthy siege. But it's hard to say if 3 men would be enough of an indication of that. He could also have taken this to have been Rome's best chance, and if he ignored them, Rome would have surrendered. Another possibility is that the Western Roman Empire did what the Eastern Roman Empire had been doing for years. Leo may not have only given Attila a speech about peace, but also a lot of money. It would have been enough for Attila to turn around, at least until the following year. While the meeting between Leo and Attila is often seen as an important moment in history, it's possible that it wouldn't have been remembered at all if Attila had lived long enough to see another campaigning season. But history is filled with powerful people who could have changed history if they had just lived a few months longer, and there are countless what-if scenarios that we'll never know the answers to. In school, students are taught that the British Parliament is the oldest parliament to exist, and it's often referred to as the mother of parliaments. The parliament is made up of the sovereign, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. It's believed that the parliament was established in the 13th century, in 1272, and grew from there. This is regarded as the first ever parliament, but what the educational system fails to mention is that another parliament was created in 930 AD. The parliament is known as the Althing, or Althingi, and is still in operation today. The unicameral legislature was founded in Thingvellir in the southwest region of Iceland in 930 AD, and is actually one of the oldest national parliaments worldwide. The freemen assembly representatives, known as things, were operating throughout medieval Scandinavia, but the Althing was the representative of the first body to practice legislative power on a national scale. The parliament would gather at Thingvellir from 930 AD to 1798, up until it was put to an end by the decree of the Danish crown in 1800. In 1845, the Althing rejoined in Reykjavik, where it stayed except for one session in Thingvellir, which manifested the formation of the Icelandic Republic on the 17th of June in 1944. Initially, Althing was established in a national park found on the Golden Circle. This was the end of the settlement era and the beginning of the Commonwealth era. 32 clans of settlers who started arriving in the area in 874 began to form assemblies and then decided that they should speak about their issues rather than fight about them. These settlers were descendants of Vikings, and so there was still a lot of fighting that persisted when the Parliament would convene each year. Even though there was a lot of fighting, the Parliament would still work. The establishment of the Parliament was a forward way of thinking at the time. The goal was to keep power as local as possible, settle feuds in a diplomatic manner, and grant divorces to unhappily married women. There were some backward events as well, such as the tying up and conviction of suspected witches in the area. The Althing Parliament did not have a leader, but they did have a law speaker who was in charge of recording and reading the Commonwealth rules from the Law Rock, also known as the Logbook. One of the law speakers was Snorri Sturluson, and he was seen as one of the most well-known and important medieval historians. Sturluson's tenure was involved in civil war and led to the Commonwealth era's end when Iceland was taken into the Norwegian Empire. Even though they were taken over by the Norwegian Empire, the Althing was still very important to the country, since the Norwegian kings did not care much for disputes of the Icelanders. The Parliament ran for many centuries unaltered, but when the Kalmar Union met its demise and Denmark was established as Iceland's management, more power was drawn away from the locals. The Althing Parliament lost all of its power aside from the court of law. The Danish king dissolved the Althing in 1800 and replaced it with the High Court of Reykjavik. As previously mentioned, it was re-established again in 1843 in Iceland's capital. Thereafter, Althing has grown with the times and became modernized. Enfranchisement involved everyone regardless of differences in gender and riches. It later achieved home rule, also known as self-governing, and then gained independence from Danish rule. Althing can now be found in the downtown area of Reykjavik, opposite to the city's cathedral. The Althing is often used as a background in photographs of protest, since Icelanders are politically active individuals. Some of the most well-known of these protests, which have also not been covered in school history lessons, were the Women's Day Off protest in 1975, the Kitchenware Revolution in 2007, and the Panama Papers in 2016. The area also has many bars and fancy restaurants equipped with terraces. In the center of the square, one may find the statue of an influential figure who was involved in the independence movement in Iceland, and his name is John Sigurdsson, another historical figure who's not often mentioned in the history textbooks. Although all worked out in the end for Althing, their past was still quite violent. Extreme measures were taken against adultery, infanticide, and witchcraft, as one would expect from the medieval era. The consequences were different for women, where they would be drowned as punishment. Between 1618 and 1749, 18 women were victims of this. This caused some sort of contradiction in the ideology. Iceland was the first country to establish a parliamentary system, but it was implemented with horrific acts, and the history of violence disfigured their past. The interior of the Althing is not open to public view, but the facade makes the building one of the most magnificent buildings in Reykjavik. The building had been designed by a Danish architect named Ferdinand Meldahl, who was also the director of the Academy of Fine Art in Copenhagen. King Christian IX of Denmark's emblem, as well as the crown, can be viewed on the top of the northern exterior. Even though the architect was a Danish man, the materials that were used in the construction of the building were all Icelandic. It's notable for the bare black rock known as dolerite. The outer areas of the building are completed with 4 reliefs underneath the windows of the second floor of the building. The reliefs are of Iceland's guardian spirits, including a giant, a large bird, a bull, and a dragon. Behind Althing, close to Lake Tjornen, is a beautiful garden said to be the oldest in Iceland. It's adorned with red tulips, which contrast against the darkness of the Parliament. Thingvellir can still be visited during the Golden Circle tour. This is where everyone can learn the history of the place, as well as bear witness to the incredible nature that can be found there, as well as see the edge of the tectonic plates. The area has no buildings because the Icelanders would set up a camp during the Parliament, although some ruins can be found, such as crumbling walls and walls underneath the water. The area was made into a national park where a flag can also be found marking the area in commemoration. When you hear the term war, you might picture some violent scenes and horrible events, and you might think that this is what you'd see with one of the longest wars ever to be recorded. But during this war, not one shot was ever fired. The Isles of Scilly is situated on the western coast of Cornwall, and they were involved in history's longest ever recorded war. The war became known as the 335-year War, which was battled between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly. This war began as a result of the English Civil War. It began in 1651 when not a single life was lost or one injury documented. The Dutch joined the side of the parliamentarians, which was being led by Oliver Cromwell, after they believed that they would win the English Civil War. Before this, the Dutch had been allies to the Royalists, loyal to King Charles I, and then they saw this as betrayal. The Royalists set out to punish them by descending upon the shipping lanes in the English Channel. Things were not going very well for the Royalists in 1651. After a few battles, Oliver Cromwell had the army back to their previous stronghold in Cornwall. The Royalists, however, had their navy sent all the way back to the Isles of Scilly. The Dutch then sent 12 warships out to the island in demand of reparations. After the Royalists refused this, the Dutch admiral Martin Tromp decided to declare war on them on the 30th of March, 1651. This was the beginning of the 335-year-long war. Whether or not Tromp had the authority to declare war remains controversial. It's debated that he was given this authority before setting out, and others believe that he went through with the blockade while he was waiting for approval from the government. 3 months after war was declared, in June of 1651, Cromwell's army was then commanded by Admiral Robert Blake. Blake had forced the Royalist fleet to submit and also forced the Isles of Scilly to revert to parliamentarian control, and so the Dutch fleet went home completely forgetting to declare peace on the Isles. In 1985, a Scilly historian and chairman of the council that governs over 140 islands of the Isles of Scilly and its 1,950 residents, named Royal Duncan, wrote to the Dutch Embassy of London asking for evidence of this claim that there was a 335-year-old war. The embassy then uncovered a couple documents suggesting that the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly were, in fact, still involved in a 335-year-long war with one another. Duncan was perhaps concerned that the Dutch threat would be renewed, and so he wrote to the Dutch ambassador. Duncan invited him to go and visit the Isles of Scilly and sign a peace treaty. The Dutch ambassador agreed, and a peace treaty was signed on the 17th of April in 1986 between the Isles of Scilly and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. In 335 years, this was the first time that the residents of Scilly were able to truly sleep safely without the fear of imminent danger. The Dutch ambassador even stated, "It must have been awful to know we could have attacked at any moment." The ambassador's flight to the Isles of Scilly even found its way into the New York Times, which reported the story, saying, quote, "The ambassador made the 28-mile journey from the southwest tip of England to the tiny cluster of islands by helicopter." It goes on to say that he had with him a scroll that declared the termination of the war. Duncan, the historian, said, quote, "The islanders have always contended that the Netherlands declared war on the islands in 1651 and never made peace afterward. The people of the Isles of Scilly did not fear the Dutch, and most of them were completely unaware of the war in the first place. But for some, it must have been a relief when the war was officially called to an end." The historical world of piracy has not been covered much in history lessons, and well-known pirates have also not made the books. One such notorious pirate was Henry Avery. Henry Avery was the first ever subject to a worldwide manhunt. Avery was known as one of the most hunted men in the world. Avery was born around Plymouth, England between the years of 1653 and 1659. He began serving on merchant ships as well as warships during the time that England and France had gone to war in 1688. A few of these ships had been held captive and the passengers were enslaved. By 1694, Avery had become first mate, and in some accounts the second mate on the privateer vessel Charles II, and later the employ of the Spanish king. The crew, who are said to mainly be English, were rather unhappy aboard and were treated terribly. The ship was headed to the Caribbean and docked in La Coruna, Spain, in May of 1694. The captain of the ship had been drunk on this evening, and soon the crew convinced Henry Avery to form a mutiny, which was done on the 7th of May in 1694. The ship was renamed the Fancy and was used for piracy, where they led attacks on the English, as well as Dutch merchantmen. Avery claimed that the English vessels did not need to worry about attacking them because he would only hijack foreign ships, but this clearly wasn't true. On the 7th of September in 1695, the Grand Mughal fleet, consisting of 25 vessels, was returning home through the Red Sea after its pilgrimage. The fleet was then attacked by 5 or 6 pirate ships, led by Avery, including the Fancy and Thomas Tew's Amity, who was able to seize jewels, gold, silver, and metals that were worth £600,000, which is the equivalent of £97 million today, or $108 million. The first ship that was attacked was the Fateh Mohammed, which was outgunned by pirates, but they had not put up much of a fight. The pirates managed to loot between £50,000 to £60,000. The amount quickly diminished after it was divided among the crew. They wanted more, and this is when the Fancy managed to catch up to the Mughal lord. The large ship was equipped with 62 cannons and up to 500 crew. First, the pirates damaged the mighty ship's mast, and then one of the cannons exploded, leading to confusion and mayhem. This struggle went on for hours, and the ship's frightened captain ran below to hide away among the enslaved women that were being kept there. Those who survived were then subject to some acts of torture by the pirates, including many women. One of the women was a member of the Grand Mughal court. Romanticized stories of this ordeal claimed that the woman, who was the daughter of the Mughal, had fallen in love with Avery and ended up running away with him. But the actuality of this may be entirely more sinister. The millions of dollars that the pirates managed to loot was one of the world's richest hauls in pirate history. Avery and his crew did not plan on sharing their gain, so they tricked the other pirates who were involved in the attack. Avery arranged for all the pirates to meet up so that they could divide the shares equally, but he didn't stay true to his word and he took off. The other ships would not be able to catch up to the Fancy, which was on its way to the Caribbean. Upon reaching New Providence Island, Avery initiated a bribe with Governor Nicholas Trott for the freedom and protection of himself and his men. Attacking the Indian ships had caused tension between India and England, and a reward was put on the capture of Avery and his men. The governor could now no longer protect them, but he did warn them and they were able to make an escape. Only 12 of Avery's men were ever caught. The remainder of the crew went their separate ways to Charleston, Ireland, England, and the Caribbean. Avery had disappeared into thin air. The East Indian Company sought to appease the Mughal Empire by paying the reparations for Avery's attacks. The Parliament then declared pirates as enemies of the human race. A £500 reward was placed on Avery's head by the government, which was doubled by the East India Company. The Board of Trade coordinated the first ever worldwide manhunt. In an unconfirmed tale, after the crew had split up, Avery and the remaining 20 members had traveled to Ireland aboard a one-masted ship called the Seaflower, which was being captained by Joseph Farrow. While they were in the process of unloading their loot, some suspicion arose. According to the story, 2 of the crew were arrested while Avery escaped yet again. In recent years, coins hinting at some of the clues were found. A silver coin was uncovered in the late 1600s. This, along with documentation, suggested that the first ever subject of a worldwide manhunt was hiding in New England before he went to Ireland. In 2004, another discovery was made. This time it was a coin that had been engraved with Arabic inscriptions. It was found in Middleton, Rhode Island. It was found that the coin had been forged in 1693 in Yemen. The coin matched up with other coins that had been taken by Avery on the 7th of September in 1695. Since this coin was found, another 26 of them have also been uncovered in England, with the exception of 3, none of which can be dated before the time of the Indian ship attack led by Avery. More gold nuggets and all sorts of coins, as well as other precious items that were looted by Avery, have been found. It was also discovered that the Seaflower arrived in Newport in 1696. The timeline of Avery's escape has proven to be muddy and often misinterpreted. It's difficult to identify where Avery's last arrival was. Upon arriving in Newport, it was found that Avery was with 3 other people, and all 3 of them escaped from India and arrived in the Bahamas on the 30th of March, 1696. 2 pirates were caught in connection with Avery, William Phillips and Edward Saville. The 2 testified on the 27th of August in 1696 and stated that only 2 of the ships left the Bahamas and went to Virginia and New England before Ireland. Some interpretations of the aforementioned muddy timeline have resulted in some believing that the pirate stayed in the Bahamas, but it's been suggested that he would not have done this since he was a fugitive. To this day, the pirate has not been discovered and still marks a very important part in history as the first ever worldwide manhunt. Another tale suggested that Avery was buried in Barnstaple, but David Graeber, an anthropologist, suggested something else. According to his story, Avery had ventured off on his 5th-class ship, Fancy and Victory. It's been suggested that they made away not just with precious jewels, but the Mughal's daughter as well as 10,000 henchmen. They then formed a kingdom in Madagascar. From his empire, Avery then supposedly dispatched ships to Europe and tricked the Swedish crown into signing treaties that established a new great power in the Indian Ocean. Avery was also able to cause Peter the Great to consider an alliance and form a Russian colony in Madagascar. Peter's predecessor, Catherine, had been tricked by the Potemkin villages, so it's thought that he should have known better. Graeber believes that the pirates stopped on the shores and survived aboard before living for ages on the remote island of Madagascar, where Pirate Avery may have even passed away. Another strange historical event that's not taught in history lessons is that the Antarctic has roots in Greece. There's not a lot of information taught about the Arctic and the Antarctic in school because they've not been thoroughly explored. 2 explorers, Frederick A. Cook and Robert E. Peary, stated that they reached the North Pole in 1909 and that they were the first people to do so. Cook explained that he and 2 Inuit travelers took cover in an ice cave during the winter period, which, according to him, caused the delay in the publication of the supposed achievement, and said they had actually reached the North Pole in April of 1908. Peary then revealed his discovery a week later, claiming that he had been the explorer that reached the Arctic first. Of course, many people were skeptical of both stories, and the correct story remains a mystery. Antarctica was said to be named in 1840 and 1890, after it had been discovered by Westerners sometime in the 1820s. In 1821, John Davis arrived at Cape Charles in the west area of Antarctica, but some historians say that the first ever visit to Antarctica was in 1895 at Cape Adare. According to new studies, though, it's now believed that it was the Polynesians who first discovered Antarctica before anybody else had, which was over 1,300 years ago. The names of the 2 areas, the Arctic and Antarctica, sound fairly similar but mean entirely opposite things. The term Arctic is derived from the Greek word arctos, which means bear. The word Antarctica incorporates the anta, which is synonymous with anti, simply translating to opposite bear. It's not yet known exactly how these names came to be, but it's theorized that the Greek term Arctos was actually a reference to the star constellation Ursa Major, or Great Bear. This constellation is a feature used in some cultures and their myths about the heavens. Another theory suggests that the name may come from the word Arcturus, which is another name for Polaris, the North Star. For the name Antarctic, some research experts suggest that it comes from the Greek term Antarktikos, which means opposite to the Arctic. The first people to explore the Arctic were ancient Greek mariners in 325 BC, as suggested by historians. It's believed that the idea of Antarctica was put forward by the ancient Greek philosophers who came to learn about the Arctic after voyages were carried out. It's suggested that the stories and descriptions of the Arctic led to the term Arctos. The Greeks identified that the world was round by this time, and hypothesized that there would be something on the opposite pole in order to balance out the world. Before the land was even discovered, the Greeks started to call the continent Antarctos. The continent then began to appear on maps for years before anyone had even gone anywhere near it. A French map of the world was created in 1530. On the left side of the image, the southern hemisphere of the world can be seen, and on the right side, the northern hemisphere is found. A continent believed to be Antarctica is labeled here as Terra Australis. There was no evidence that this continent existed yet, but it was still inserted on the map to the Greeks' hypothesis.
Additionally, there's no Australian continent, since it was not yet discovered until the 1600s upon European exploration. It's now believed that the first actual observation of Antarctica was on the 27th or 28th of January in 1820, when a voyage was carried out by two Russian ships called the Vostok and Mirny, which were commanded by Captain Fabian Bellinghausen. The expedition was a 2-year voyage around the world in order to discover new areas for Russia. The captain's ships are said to be the first to cross the Antarctic Circle on the 26th of January in 1820. For quite some time, it was also believed that the first ever person to see Antarctica was an Irishman named Edward Bransfield. It's stated that he was on a British voyage on the 30th of January in 1820 on a ship called Williams. The Irishman is believed to have found the actual Antarctica continent rather than smaller offshore islands. In 1819, the same ship was being commanded by Captain William Smith, who then discovered the Shetland Islands. Smith returned to Chile to report what he had discovered. Captain Sheriff of the Royal Navy then sent out a ship of which Bransfield was captain, leading to his discovery of the full continent. Bransfield reportedly saw the Trinity Peninsula and described high mountains covered with snow. He was certain at the time about what he saw, but Bellinghausen was not. He thought it to be an iceberg, and so his claims had been ignored. There were also misinterpretations of the captain's journal, but in recent years it was looked over again and it was discovered that Captain Bellinghausen may have been the first one to have seen the continent. Then we come to the claims of the first landing on the continent of Antarctica. The first one comes from British-American John Davis, as previously mentioned. It's been suggested that he arrived on the continent on the ship Cecilia on the 7th of February, 1821. There were claims suggesting that the crew aboard this ship had gotten off to look for seals, but this account cannot be confirmed. This is where the claim of the landing in Cape Adair came in. It suggested that the actual first landing on the continent was in 1895 on the ship called the Antarctic, which was being led by Henry Bull. It's uncertain which crew member was the first to get onto the continent, as they all got out of boats one after another. Karsten Borchgrevink maintained that he was the first person to set foot on the continent, while a New Zealander named Alex von Tunzelman said that it was him. Another claim was made by Captain Leonard Christensen, who stated that it had been he who got out of the boat first. Tunzelman stated that he was trying to steady the boat while the others got out, but if this were the case, he would have been standing in the water and not on dry land. It remains controversial as to who exactly discovered the continent and who stepped foot on it first. All that's known is that the ancient Greeks had knowledge of the Arctic and assumed there was another part opposite of it, and initiated the discovery of the continent no matter who actually had seen it first. The names of the continents were also maintained over the years after being suggested by the Greeks, but it appears more than likely that it was the Greeks who first discovered both of these places, based on the names suggesting that there are bears in the Arctic and no bears in Antarctica. These claims remain unconfirmed and are one of the world's biggest mysteries. Antonio Lopez de Santa Ana Perez de Lebrón was born on the 21st of February in 1794 in Jalapa, Mexico. Santa Ana was a Mexican army officer as well as a statesman at the center of Mexican politics in events such as the Texas Revolution from 1835 to 1836, and the Mexican-American War, which started in 1846 to 1848. He was the child of a minor colonial official and also served in the Spanish Army, where he later became captain. Santa Ana is said to have fought on both sides of every problem that arose. Santa Ana was in support of Agustin de Iturbide in 1821, as well as the Mexican Independence War. In 1823, he aided in the overthrow of Iturbide. Santa Ana also supported Vicente Guerrero for the presidency, and then later helped to overthrow him as well. The official rose to fame in 1829 after he fought Spain, who were attempting to conquer Mexico. Santa Ana was later nicknamed Hero of Tampico. In 1833, Santa Ana became president as a Federalist and was also a rival against the Roman Catholic Church. He formed a centralized state. Santa Ana remained in the presidency up until 1836. He stormed into Texas to put an end to protests there. He later moved to the east area of the San Jacinto River,
and this is where he met his defeat. On the 21st of April, Santa Anna was defeated in the Battle of San Jacinto and was then caught by General Sam Houston. He then signed a public treaty which ended the war, and then he signed a secret treaty where he maintained that he would do anything in his power to make sure that the Mexican government agreed to the public treaty. After that, Santa Anna had been sent to Washington, D.C., where he had an interview with Andrew Jackson, the US president. Jackson then sent him back to Mexico. During this time, Santa Anna was overthrown due to his absence. The French Navy had seized Veracruz in 1838, where they demanded insurance for the injuries of the French people in Mexico. Santa Anna then led an army into Veracruz, where they shot down ships while they departed. During this battle, Santa Anna unfortunately lost his leg. When a French cannon grape shot had been fired, his leg ended up getting severely injured. Due to the state of the injuries, the doctors were left with no choice but to amputate the leg. The leg was buried at Santa Anna's Veracruz hacienda. He later resumed his presidency in 1842 and retrieved the leg, which he paraded to Mexico City. The leg was placed in an ornate coach as it was paraded around. It was later buried underneath a cemetery monument where a state funeral was held. This included cannon salvos, poetry, and lofty sermons. Santa Anna's amputated leg did not stay here for too long. The public turned against him in 1844, and a riot broke out which tore down the statues and dug up his leg. The leg was fastened to a rope and hauled through the Mexico City streets while the mob chanted horrible terms. In 1847, in the Battle of Cerro Gordo in the Mexican-American War, Santa Anna was ambushed by the 4th Illinois Infantry, and he left hurriedly, leaving his very important prosthetic cork as well as his wooden leg behind. The soldiers got a hold of the leg and kept it as a trophy and took it back to their state. The prosthetic had toured around the country until it ended up in the possession of the Illinois State Military Museum. The Amazon rainforest is one of the last unexplored places on Earth. Every year, scientists are learning more about the flora and fauna that call the forest home. Many species can only be found in this specific forest, and there may be many more that remain undiscovered. The forest is filled with secrets and unanswered mysteries waiting to be unraveled. While many of those mysteries surround the natural world, there are many historical mysteries beneath the tree canopy. When European explorers arrived in South America, it wasn't long before the legend of El Dorado began to spread. Many believed this mythical city of gold was hidden in the depths of the rainforest, and countless expeditions set out to try to find it. The explorations did a relatively good job of mapping the inhospitable jungle, but they didn't find any cities, made of gold or otherwise. One Spanish conquistador brought back stories of large villages and farms on the banks of the Amazon River after he paddled up the river. He also claimed to have seen larger cities in the distance, but when later explorers went to corroborate his claims, they could find nothing. For centuries, it was assumed that only small nomadic tribes had ever lived in the Amazon, and only on the banks of the river. The heart of the rainforest was seen as an untouched natural wilderness. All attempts to tame the rainforest have been disastrous, and scientists and explorers believed it was impossible any larger civilizations could have lived in the forest. While we often see the Amazon as a place filled with lush plants and trees, the soil itself isn't very fertile. For centuries, farmers and other settlers have tried to clear the trees from the forest to make way for new crops. The soil doesn't have the nutrients needed to raise crops, though. Once the forest is cleared, it's difficult to grow anything there at all. This would be the same problem that anybody trying to live inside the forest itself would face. Any civilization that relied on agriculture of any kind would struggle to survive, and a hunter-gatherer lifestyle wouldn't work for the large cities that were supposedly hidden in the rainforest. But the same process that told scientists it was impossible for major civilizations to exist in the rainforest has shown that it did happen. Beginning in the 80s, deforestation in Brazil's Acre state began to uncover the floor beneath. This supposedly pristine land had previously been worked by humans before. It wasn't stone villages that were uncovered, but giant geoglyphs that could be thousands of feet wide. When talking about geoglyphs, especially in South America, the Nazca lines of Peru come to mind. These earthworks have fascinated researchers for decades. Images of creatures have been made in the desert soil and are best seen by air. There are many theories about why these were created, but the Nazca lines remain a famous mystery. The Amazonian geoglyphs are much different to their Peruvian cousins, though. The earthworks are basic shapes, mostly squares and circles, with some hexagons and straight lines connecting various areas. They're made up of ditches which are about 30 feet wide and 10 feet deep, with 3-foot-high walls of soil alongside them. Most are relatively small, but some are up to 1,000 feet across. Since they were first recognized in the 1980s, thousands of these earthworks have been found across the state of Acre and neighboring Bolivia. Many are found nowhere near the Amazon River itself, but some are nearby other water sources. In 2014, scientists were able to reveal some details about the earthworks, which changed how we thought about human habitation in the Amazon forever. For a long time, it was believed that the earthworks were made around 200 CE, but scientists analyzed the soil and found charcoal that dates back thousands of years. It's now believed that these earthworks were built about 6,000 years ago. At this time, the Amazon was completely different to what we know today. It more closely resembled the African savanna today. The indigenous people created these mounds and ditches and are believed to have cultivated the area around them for thousands of years. They did this through controlled burning, but in a manner that helped the forest to recover and grow, rather than the permanent destruction we see today. Palm trees were the most commonly planted tree. Even today, these are the trees most commonly found in areas where the soil is rich. One possibility is that the ancient Amazonian people created this rich soil, known as terra preta, to grow their crops in the otherwise harsh environment. Palm trees were abundant for 3,000 years but eventually gave way to the trees more commonly seen in the Amazon today. This happened a few hundred years after the earthworks were abandoned. The planted Amazon theory is just a theory at this point. How much influence the ancient people had over the rainforest isn't known yet, but it's clear that they shaped the world around them to a certain extent. While more recent studies have found settlements in some of these earthworks, many have no evidence of permanent habitation. Experts remain baffled about what they could have been used for. One theory is that they were for defense. A lot of the geoglyphs are found on flat plains, which would have made earthworks necessary to defend a position. But when there's nothing within the ditches that seems worth defending, it's obvious this theory has some problems. Another theory is that these were used for draining or irrigation, due to the number that were found near water sources. That may have been the purpose of some geoglyphs, but it wouldn't make sense for others. The researchers who did the initial study on the earthworks believed that they may have been for ceremonial purposes. They could have been used for large gatherings like weddings or similar ceremonies, or have something to do with an annual event, like the fruiting season. Smashed vessels have been found nearby, which could have once carried food and drink that was used in the ceremonies. Unfortunately, while there is evidence that there was once a thriving culture within the Amazon, it has since long gone. Why it disappeared is another one of the unsolved mysteries of this area. It's possible that the culture was thriving up until the arrival of the Europeans. It's known that European diseases spread much faster than the Europeans themselves, and the people living in the Amazon would have had no protection if smallpox or some other disease made its way into the forest. It's believed that the earthworks themselves were abandoned long before the Europeans arrived, which suggests that there was some other shift that may have moved people out of the rainforest. Learning more about this culture and how they managed the land could help modern civilizations living in the area to use the Amazon in a more suitable way. Unfortunately, those secrets are still within the Amazon itself, and uncovering them might also be damaging. Before the arrival of the Europeans in the Americas, roughly 22 million people lived in Mesoamerica. When the Spanish discovered the New World, they brought with them livestock, a new religion, and diseases that swept through the population. The most famous of these diseases was smallpox, which would later hit those living in North America. But another mysterious disease was even more devastating. The Aztecs called it Cocolitzli, which translates roughly to pestilence or plague in the Nahua language. Neither the Spanish nor the native population had ever seen something like this before, and were at a loss to explain what was happening. The disease came in waves, worked quickly, and claimed the lives of around 15 million people in just a few years. A second wave shortly afterwards took the lives of half the remaining population, leaving just 2 million indigenous Americans living in the area that would become Mexico. It was the beginning of August 1545 when the mysterious Cocolitzli was first recorded. This was only 25 years after the last smallpox pandemic. That disease had wiped out approximately 8 million people, crippling the Aztec Empire and the other indigenous communities in South America. The population hadn't even begun to recover, while the Spanish system of encomienda had only made lives worse for those that survived the disease. Native laborers would work the land and pay a tribute to Spanish settlers in return for protection. The poor conditions, little food, and hard work likely only made things worse when Cocolitzli hit. The disease worked quickly, with most reports at the time saying that it only took a few days to take the life of a victim. Symptoms included fevers, jaundice-like symptoms, great thirst, and bleeding from the nose and other parts of the body. It would have been horrific to see, as almost everybody that contracted the disease passed away. After about 5 years, 15 million people had passed away. The level of devastation was only comparable to the Black Death, which is believed to have wiped out 60% of Europe. In Europe, after the Black Death, the economic system was forced to change as there weren't enough people to work the land. The same happened in New Spain, but conditions didn't get much better for the native population. The system of repartimiento still demanded tributes to Spanish settlers, and what was left of the native population was still forced to live in awful conditions. It's not surprising that Cocolitzli came back. Most of the information we have about the disease comes from the second wave, which began in 1576. A Spanish doctor named Francisco Hernandez de Toledo was sent to New Spain by the king to try to get to the bottom of the disease. He conducted extensive research, learned 5 native languages, and conducted autopsies to try to find the source of the illness. What he discovered was unlike anything he had seen before. The disease was clearly something that had traveled through the circulatory system and seemed to impact the liver significantly. De Toledo had at one point been the personal physician of the Spanish king, so when he couldn't identify the disease, it was unlikely any of the other European doctors would have done much better. The local doctors also didn't have an answer, which seemed to suggest that it hadn't been brought over to the New World by the Spanish, as smallpox had, but something didn't quite add up. Researchers have found that the disease only got worse as it reached higher altitudes and colder climates. It's not clear why this is, but the pattern didn't line up with what would be expected of a disease introduced by European settlers. Many sources claim that the disease seemed to hit the native population much harder than the Spanish. While a native person who contracted the disease would likely pass away within a few days, the Spanish only suffered mild symptoms and usually recovered. This again seemed to indicate that it was something the Spanish would be used to. In the case of smallpox, the European settlers weren't hit too hard by outbreaks because they were already used to the disease and had built up a resistance. That seemed to be what happened with Cocolitzli. But later epidemics of the disease continued to hit those of native descent harder than those of European descent, even though both groups had never even been exposed to the disease before. This could be a sign that it was actually the conditions these people lived in that decided whether or not they would survive, rather than their ancestry. There would be a total of 4 major Cocolitzli outbreaks in Mexico, and many more minor ones. The last of these outbreaks was in 1815. Since then, experts have continued to speculate about what could have caused the mysterious disease. For a long time, an unknown fever disease was believed to be behind the epidemics. These diseases matched a lot of the symptoms that were reported during the Cocolitzli outbreaks. In particular, the way the disease seemed to appear from nowhere and stop just as suddenly as it started seemed to resemble some of these fever diseases that we still see today. But no one disease lined up with everything reported by doctors and other witnesses in the 16th century, leaving behind a historical mystery. Some believe the mystery may have something to do with the climate. Both 1545 and 1576 were wet years in the middle of mega droughts that spread across the Americas. The droughts would have weakened local population, and hygiene likely wouldn't have been as good due to the lack of water. In both years, the epidemic spread most rapidly as the rainy season hit, suggesting this had something to do with the spread. In 2018, researchers believed they might have found the answer to this strange mystery, or at least one of the answers. Researchers excavated a cemetery from the 1500s. Most of the remains came from the 1545 epidemic, while a few had passed away beforehand. Scientists were able to extract DNA from teeth. Bacteria that had infected the bloodstream would become trapped within the dental pulp of the tooth after the person had passed away and it was protected from the elements. This was then analyzed and compared by hand to countless known diseases. Of those, they found that salmonella was a match. We often think of salmonella being basic food poisoning, but different kinds of the bacteria can cause more serious diseases like typhoid. The bacteria was only found in the teeth of those who passed during the epidemic, and not those who passed before contact with the old world. But it seems unlikely that salmonella is the only cause of the Coco-Litzli infection. Some argue that the disease couldn't have caused all the different symptoms, and believe a mixture of different diseases might be responsible. The researchers did point out that they could only detect DNA, and diseases that only produced RNA would have gone undetected by their method. It's been over 200 years since the last outbreak of the Coco-Litzli infection. It's possible that the disease went extinct after the last outbreak, or it mutated into something that was less dangerous to humans. But it's also possible that the disease is simply dormant and may one day be rediscovered. If there were to be another outbreak today, it's possible that it would claim more lives than ever before, and solving this mystery would be essential for saving lives. When the city of Pompeii was discovered in the 16th century, it provided the best opportunity archaeologists could hope for to learn more about the day-to-day life of Roman citizens. In the 1st century CE, Pompeii was a thriving, wealthy city. It was home to thousands of people, sitting in the shadow of a dormant volcano. When that volcano erupted in 79 CE, a pyroclastic flow swept through the city, taking the lives of all the residents. The city was buried under 6 meters of ash and was forgotten about for the next 1,600 years. As archaeologists uncovered the city, a snapshot of everyday life in Rome was revealed. While the rest of the cities from ancient times had mostly been dismantled and repurposed by later occupants, Pompeii was exactly how it had been left when Emperor Titus ruled. Archaeologists were amazed by everything from the mosaics to the graffiti. It helped solve the mysteries of everyday life in ancient Rome, but one of the buildings provided more questions than answers. The Villa of Mysteries sits at the edge of Pompeii. There were about 100 of these villas in the region, but none compared to this one. It had at least 60 rooms and covered about 40,000 square feet. The luxurious building was roughly 200 years old when it was covered in ash and forgotten about, and likely served as both a small working farm as well as a luxury home. Who owned the villa at any point is a mystery and is still debated by scholars. It likely passed through many different families. One suggestion is that it was owned by Livia, wife of Emperor Augustus, as a bust of the noblewoman was found in the house. Also found was the bronze seal of Zosimus, a wealthy family. The seal was found with some of the bodies located in the villa, which may indicate that this family owned the luxurious building when it was destroyed. While this unsolved question will likely remain a mystery, it isn't what gives the villa the title of the Villa of Mysteries. One of the rooms in the villa caught more attention than the others. It's roughly 15 feet by 15 feet and covered in frescoes. The intricate artwork was crafted directly into the wall as the plaster was drying, and it's designed in such a way that it gives the impression that the room is much bigger. The frescoes have been preserved for almost 2,000 years, but almost as soon as they were uncovered, they began to deteriorate. Restoration and conservation work has gone underway to try to protect these mysterious images for generations to come. The artwork depicts a scene or multiple scenes that have puzzled experts for decades. One of the most popular theories is that the artwork depicts a woman being initiated into the cult of Dionysus. The cult of Dionysus was one of the many mystery cults in ancient Rome. There were 2 sets of rites for this cult, one public and one known only to those that had been initiated. The The cult was one of the oldest in the ancient world, having likely developed from a general wine and vegetation cult, which itself was 1,000 years old. Dionysus was one of the strangest of the ancient gods. He's most famous today as the god of wine, but he's also a god of madness and had associations with the underworld. Given the fact it was a mystery cult, not a lot is known about it. The little information we have about the cult of Dionysus is that worshippers would go into a trance-like state after drinking alcohol with additives, in the hopes of being possessed by the god himself or one of his entourage. How someone would be initiated remains a mystery, but some scholars believe the artwork shows just that. If interpreted that way, the fresco is actually a series of snapshots of the initiation process, showing first a young woman wearing a veil beside a priestess sitting on a throne, then going through a trial before joining satyrs and other members of the cult. In the center of the image is Dionysus, lying beside either his mother or his wife. For many, the center image confirms this theory, but there are other possible answers to this mystery. Some believe the young woman is actually a bride-to-be preparing for her wedding ceremony. Dionysus and his wife were symbols of marriage. It could be that rather than this being a ritual for initiating someone into the cult, it was simply a pre-marriage ritual that hadn't been written about elsewhere. Another, less popular theory is that the whole thing was designed to be a play of some kind. The Villa of Mysteries is by far the most mysterious thing uncovered in the ruins of Pompeii, and shows us just how much we don't know about ancient Rome. For now, all we can do is preserve what has already been uncovered in the hopes that someone in the future might be able to crack this mystery. Throughout history, the stars in the night sky have been incredibly important. The position of the stars determined everything from navigation to the time to plant crops. It was also a source of wonder, and ancient people around the world told stories about the constellations and individual stars that were either particularly vibrant or important for other reasons. Of these stories, the story of Pleiades stars is one of the oldest and one of the most mysterious. It's not surprising that different cultures had different stories, and even picked out different images from the same sets of stars. The map of the night sky looks slightly different in different parts of the world, and any number of images can be made out from random clusters of lights. But the Pleiades story is one that's eerily similar around the world. The Pleiades was an incredibly important cluster of stars in the ancient world. They were used as part of a calendar. In Mexico, for example, they were called the seed stars, as when they disappeared in the spring, it was time for planting to begin. The stars are one of the earliest that we have records of, with ancient Chinese writing describing the stars in 2350 BC. Given their brightness in the night sky and how their journey across the sky lines up with important times of the year, it's not surprising that so many cultures told stories about these stars. What is surprising is how similar those stories are. The Pleiades gets its name from the Greek myth. In that myth, the titan Atlas has 7 daughters with the ocean nymph Pleione. After Atlas was made by Zeus to hold the world on his shoulders, he was unable to protect his daughters. They caught the attention of the hunter Orion, who chased after the daughters. To protect them, Zeus turned the daughters into doves and placed them in the night sky. Then, for some reason, he put Orion in the sky too. The story changes slightly from telling to telling, as it would have been passed down by oral tradition, so there are many different versions. But all have the 7 daughters being chased after Orion. Orion is one of the most notable constellations in the night sky, and can be used to find Pleiades. By tracing a line from Orion's belt, a stargazer would find the bright star of Aldebaran, the eye of the bull of Taurus. Following that line a little further, the stargazer finds the cluster of bright stars. But there's one noticeable difference between the myth and the star cluster seen today. Even on a clear night away from any pollution, most people can only make out 6 stars with the naked eye. Looking through a telescope, there are far more than 6 or even 7 stars visible. The Pleiades is an open star cluster made up of more than 1,000 stars about 410 light-years away. All are relatively young and may even be less than 100 million years old. They're bright blue in color and are likely to only live to be a few 100 million years old. For reference, our sun is 4.6 billion years old and will likely have a lifespan of just about 10 billion years. Of course, the ancient civilizations that told stories about this star cluster wouldn't have known this, and it would have been one of the brightest stars visible without a telescope. In the ancient Greek myth, one of the sisters, Merope, marries a mortal Sisyphus. According to the myths, Sisyphus committed many crimes and tricked the gods multiple times. When he was eventually dragged to the underworld, he was made to forever push a boulder up a hill. Merope was either shamed into hiding or is partially veiled after joining her husband in the underworld, and so she isn't visible to the humans on Earth. Having a story about a star that couldn't actually be seen wouldn't be too strange, but the ancient Greeks weren't the only group to have this story. In Aboriginal Australian legends, the Pleiades were again a group of 7 young women being chased by a hunter or a group of men. One of the women hid from the men or otherwise escaped. In some versions of the story, she was caught, while in others she managed to get away. Hindu folktales tell the story of Criticus, a group of 7 women who were married to 7 wise men. Another man named Agni was in love with the Criticus, but was upset when they were all married. A woman named Svaha disguised herself as one of the 6 and married Agni, producing children. This then caused 6 of the Criticus to separate from their husbands, causing the Pleiades cluster, while the 7th couple remained married and formed the Alcor-Mazar pairing in the Big Dipper. Around the world, there are many stories of 7 young men forming the Pleiades, only for one to become separated. These stories are seen even in cultures that had no contact with one another, like the Aboriginal Australians. How this came to be is a mystery. Some scholars believe that the story is as old as humanity and originated back when all humans lived in Africa. At the time, the stars Atlas and Pleione appeared further away in the night sky and would have been visible as 2 separate stars, making 7 visible in the cluster. Today, the much smaller Pleione is almost entirely covered by Atlas, and so appears to be 1 star. The story of the 7 sisters, or women, was carried by every culture as they migrated around the world. If this theory is correct, the basic story would be 100,000 years old. Others argue that Pleione and Atlas wouldn't have looked much different than they do today, so this could be the explanation. They also question whether it would be possible for a story to last such a long time. There is evidence that other stories about the stars have spread long distances. In Europe, Northern Asia, and America, the constellation of the Big Dipper is seen as a bear. In Europe, the handle of the ladle is seen as the bear's tail, but in Eastern Russia, it's often depicted as being hunters. One of the stars has a much smaller star beside it, and this is the Alcor-Mazar pairing. In the Russian stories, this is a hunter and a bird helping the humans. The same story appears in Native American versions of the story. This spread would be much more recent than that of the 7 sisters. It's commonly believed Native Americans migrated from Eastern Russia 14,000 years ago, whereas the 7 sisters would be about 100,000 years old. But it shows that this spread is possible on a smaller scale. This is one ancient mystery that may never be solved, but could shed light on how humans began telling stories, and how those stories evolved over thousands of years. Lots of places that historians once thought were ancient myths have turned out to be real places. The most famous of these was Troy, famous for being the scene of the Trojan War. But sometimes, even when we know a place is an actual historic land, finding out exactly where that land was is impossible. For a long time, the land of Punt was believed to be some kind of mythical land that the ancient Egyptians spoke of. It seemed to be a type of utopia, and was home to all the items that the Egyptians used for their religious practices. What didn't help was the fact that its alternative name was God's Land. According to the ancient Egyptian records, the land of Punt existed as far back as the 4th dynasty. During the 26th century BC, gold was brought into Egypt from this foreign land, and there's a relief that shows the son of the pharaoh with someone from Punt, a Puntite. It wouldn't be until the next dynasty that the first expedition to Punt took place, organized by the pharaoh Sahur. But there were more trade envoys sent from Egypt to the mystical land throughout the Old and the New Kingdoms. The most famous of these was organized by Queen Hatshepsut in the 8th year of her reign in 1471. This was the first expedition of the New Kingdom, and it's possible that the way to Punt had been lost during the intermediate period. According to writing by the ancient Egyptians, an oracle of Amun instructed Hatshepsut to go on this voyage to the land of Punt. She took with her 5 ships, each with 30 rowers. This trip was depicted in carvings on Hatshepsut's mortuary temple, as well as many of her other achievements. The voyage showed the boats sailing over fish, many of which are found in the waters of the Red Sea. This confused scholars who had never found evidence of the ancient Egyptians traveling by sea before. Traveling along the Nile was one thing, but even the waters close to the coast would be difficult to travel without expertise. It was only in 2011 that evidence of the ancient Egyptian seafaring was discovered. A dried-up lagoon on Egypt's coast was excavated, revealing a shipyard complete with everything that the Egyptians would need to make the overseas voyage. According to the ancient Egyptian records, the expedition brought back gold, myrrh, frankincense, cosmetics, and exotic animals and plants. Some of these were incense trees, one of which was planted outside the mortuary temple. It's said that the roots of this tree are still visible today. There are also many reliefs depicting Puntites. They're always shown in the same manner, suggesting that these are the same groups of people. They're depicted as having dark reddish skin with long hair. The men wear short skirts while the women are depicted in longer skirts. The panels at the Hatshepsut temple specifically depict the prince or chief of Punt, Parehu, and his wife. Interestingly, Parehu is depicted with a beard that curls upwards. This style is typically reserved for the gods or pharaohs that were no longer alive. Other details depicted in Egyptian artwork include a tropical-like climate and bee-comb houses that sit on stilts. It was unlike any other land the Egyptians knew of. Some sources indicate that the Egyptians believed that the land of Punt was where they had once come from, and that they had migrated from the area long ago before settling in Egypt. It was also thought to be a land where the gods lived, given the amount of precious resources that could be found there. Some of these were believed to be native to Punt, while others were brought from elsewhere to Punt, making it something of a trade hub. The problem with this is that there are no records from any other land describing trade with Punt. If it was as rich as the Egyptian records portrayed, then it would likely have caught the attention of other civilizations. Egypt wasn't the only other civilization in the area capable of traveling by sea, and such riches would have made other empires want to travel there too. It's possible that these empires called it by some other name, but the other details about Punt have not been attributed to any other civilization. Punt also had a remarkably peaceful relationship with Egypt. Egyptian writers go out of their way to describe the land of Punt as being filled with extremely generous people, and it's portrayed in a good light. There are no records of any kind of war between Egypt and Punt. Egypt wasn't afraid to go to war with its neighbors, and given the amount of resources in this other land, it would have been a huge target. There also are no records of any other civilization going to war with Punt. With no other records of the kingdom, the ruler being depicted in the same manner as the gods were depicted, and its wealth, it's easy to see why scholars believed this might have been a land of myth. It could be easy to see the depictions of Hatshepsut going to this land of the gods and bringing back great wealth as being a metaphor for her success, or having won the support of the gods, especially seeing as this was a voyage requested by an oracle. But there is evidence that Egypt was doing trade with someone in that general area, where they placed Punt. Baboons are not native to Egypt. According to ancient Egyptian records, these came from the land of Punt. Egyptians brought back thousands of these monkeys, which would be kept as pets or used like guard dogs. Egyptologists have found hundreds of mummified remains of these baboons. The trade from Punt definitely existed. This still leaves the mystery of where the land was. Egyptian records only describe it as being to the south and east of them. Scholars have suggested locations along the coast of the Red Sea. Most believe it was in Africa somewhere, though some believe the wildlife described lines up better with the Arabian Peninsula. Modern-day Somalia and Ethiopia have also been suggested as possible locations for Punt, and a region of Somalia is even named after the kingdom, though the name Puntland was given to it in the modern day. Isotopes from the teeth of some of the oldest baboons match those found in the teeth of modern baboons from Somalia, Ethiopia, and other areas. Some have also pointed out the similarities between the language of the ancient Egyptians and Somali, suggesting some kind of exchange there. But no physical evidence of some long-lost kingdom in the area has ever been located. Even if the land of Punt is one day discovered, that still wouldn't answer other questions about this mysterious place. How this land managed to survive and remain so apparently stable for such a long time is one such mystery. It's possible that this mystery may one day be solved if more records from Egypt or the surrounding areas are uncovered, which could shed light on the mysterious Punt's history and the history of the most famous ancient civilization. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.